It was sometime past midnight when I woke up in the tent. My bladder was making it very clear that it wasn't going to wait until morning. The kind of urgency that stirs you even from the deepest sleep. At first, I tried to ignore it, rolled over, pulled the sleeping bag tighter, but the pressure didn't go away. The night was dead quiet, save for the faint rustling of trees outside and the occasional creak from the tent fabric as the wind nudged it. I lay there for another minute, staring into the darkness above me, trying to will myself back to sleep, but I knew I had no choice. The tent was still warm from body heat, a little pocket of comfort in the middle of the cold forest. Crawling out was always the worst part of these late-night bathroom runs, especially on chilly nights like this one. I unzipped the sleeping bag, instantly feeling the temperature drop. I sat up slowly, moving as quietly as I could, trying not to wake the others. My friends were scattered across 2 other tents about 15 feet away. I could make out the shape of one through the mesh of mine, but it was hard to see much else. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from the faint glow of dying embers in the fire pit. I reached over to unzip the tent door. The zipper made that all too familiar scratching sound, unnaturally loud in the silence of the forest. I paused for a second, just listening. No sounds of movement, just the light breeze passing through the trees. I leaned forward, pushing the flap aside, and stuck my head out to check the surroundings. I meant to do the usual, scan for movement, make sure I didn't surprise a raccoon or trip over someone's gear. But as soon as I looked out, I froze. There, not even 3 feet in front of my face, crouched low in the dirt, was a cougar. My eyes locked on its yellow-green ones instantly. I wasn't fully out of the tent, still half inside, one knee down, hand bracing myself. It didn't move, neither did I. The stillness between us was terrifying. Everything else, wind, night sounds, breath, seemed to vanish. Just me, half out of the tent, and this massive predator, crouched low like it had been stalking or waiting. We stared at each other. Couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds, but it felt like a small eternity. My brain scrambled to remember everything I'd ever read or heard about mountain lions. Make yourself big. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Don't act like prey. But none of that really applied to someone stuck half inside a tent with one hand planted awkwardly on the ground and their knee in the dirt. I was in a horrible position, low, small, off balance, completely vulnerable. Still, the cougar didn't leap. It didn't growl or lunge or hiss. It just stared, like it was sizing me up. Maybe it had been sniffing around the camp, maybe following the scent of food or just curious. Maybe it had been watching us for a while. I don't know. But in that moment, I was nothing more than another creature in its world. It didn't seem scared, just focused. I could see the way its body was coiled. Muscles taut, ears forward, tail barely twitching. Could have moved fast if it wanted to. Could have been on me in a split second. Something shifted in its eyes, and I got the sense that it was done observing. I could almost feel it reaching a conclusion. Maybe it decided I wasn't a threat. Or maybe it decided I was a maybe. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck and back. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. My mouth was dry. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. My body screamed to move, to run, to slam the tent flap shut. But instinct kept me frozen. And then, almost without thinking, I made a sound. A noise started in my chest and came out louder than I intended. A guttural, wild sort of bellow. Not a scream, not a roar, but something primal. I didn't plan it. I didn't even know I was going to do it. It just came out, some desperate mix of fear and defiance. I made myself as loud as I could, trying to project confidence and strength in a single, unbroken sound that echoed out into the woods. For a split second, the cougar didn't react. But then its ears shifted back, and its eyes narrowed just slightly. It didn't jump or snarl. It just slowly stood up, tail low, muscles still tense. It watched me a moment longer, and then turned, deliberate and unhurried, and walked off into the trees, like it had decided this wasn't worth the effort. I stayed frozen for a long time after it vanished into the dark. I couldn't hear it anymore. No snapping twigs, no paw steps, just the normal night sounds coming back into focus. Wind in the branches, the whisper of leaves, the slight crackle from the fire pit. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum that had just popped. Eventually, I backed into the tent slowly, never turning my back to the opening. I zipped the flap up in short, careful bursts, trying not to make too much noise. I sat there in the dark for a while, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking the tent walls. My breath came in short, quiet gasps, and I tried to control it, but my body was still in panic mode. At some point, I realized I still had to pee. That was the whole reason I'd gotten up in the first place. But there was no way I was going outside again. Not for anything. I found an empty plastic bottle in my pack and did what I had to do right there in the tent. Not ideal, but it was better than becoming a cougar snack. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every gust of wind against the tent fabric made my stomach tighten. I kept thinking I'd hear heavy paws again, or worse, feel them pressing down on the tent wall. But the night passed quietly after that. When the sky finally started to lighten a little, and the birds began to chirp in that soft, cautious way they do before dawn, I finally dared to unzip the tent and peek out. Everything looked normal. My boots were still where I'd left them. The fire pit was just a pile of cold ash. No obvious signs of the cougar. No tracks. No broken branches. Just the usual quiet camp morning, like nothing had happened. Eventually, the others stirred. One by one, they crawled out of their tents, yawning and stretching, complaining about stiff backs and cold toes. I didn't tell them what had happened right away. I was still trying to process it myself. But when one of them asked why I looked like I hadn't slept a wink, I told them the story. First, they didn't believe me. Then one of them laughed, said he remembered hearing some kind of crazy shout in the middle of the night, like someone had just seen a ghost. That made the rest of them laugh too. I didn't correct them, let them think whatever they wanted. I knew what I'd seen. I spent the rest of that morning walking around the edge of the campsite, just scanning the ground. I didn't find anything solid, no tracks, no scat, nothing. But that didn't surprise me. Cougars are quiet. They're shadows in the woods. You only ever see one if it wants to be seen. And that one had been right in front of me, not even an arm's length away. It wasn't until later, when we were all back home and someone mentioned the trip, that I could talk about it without feeling that jolt of fear again. Even now, when I think about that night, I remember the cougar's eyes. The way it looked at me, not afraid, not angry, just calm, curious, almost like it was thinking through its options. People like to talk big about camping and roughing it. They bring coolers full of beer, wear their flannel shirts, and talk about escaping civilization. But out there at night with no fence, no lights, no walls, you're not in charge. You're a guest. And sometimes the real owners of the land come to remind you of that. I still go camping. I still love the quiet, the space, the crackle of the fire. But I don't crawl out of the tent without checking everything 3 times. I never wander off alone at night. And I always make sure I've got a flashlight, a whistle, and a clear head. Because out there, in the dark, you're not at the top of the food chain. You're just a body among trees. And if you're lucky, the thing watching you decides you're too much trouble to mess with. That night changed the way I see the woods. I still respect them, still feel a kind of peace there. But I know what's out there now. Not stories, not shadows, not ghosts, real things, with eyes that reflect just enough light to stop your heart, and paws that make no sound at all. I never saw that cougar again. I hope I never do, but I'll never forget that moment, me, halfway out of my tent, and that silent, perfect predator watching me like I was just one more thing in the dark. And every time I unzip a tent flap now, I pause. I look, I listen, because sometimes the forest is watching back. When I was a kid, maybe around 9 or 10, my mom took me on a weekend camping trip. Nothing fancy, just a basic drive-in campground, the kind with picnic tables and fire rings and vault toilets that always seemed too dark inside. We didn't have much gear back then, just an old dome tent, a couple of folding chairs, a cooler, and sleeping bags. My mom was always trying to give us little adventures when she could. We didn't have a lot of money, but she was good at making things feel special. This place was maybe 2 or 3 hours from home, somewhere tucked between hills and pine trees with a slow river winding along the edge of the campground. I don't even remember the name of it now, just the feeling of dry dirt and pine needles crunching under my shoes, the way the air smelled like wood smoke and sun-warmed sap. We got there late morning on a Saturday, found a spot that was mostly shaded, and started setting up. I remember there were only a handful of other campers scattered around. It wasn't a busy place, which was fine by me. I was a pretty shy kid, never liked being around big crowds, and even at that age I found quiet places more comforting than noisy ones. A few sites down from us, there was this older guy who looked like he was camping solo. I noticed him when we drove in. He had a weathered-looking blue pickup truck with a topper on the back, and he'd set up one of those reclining camp chairs next to it. He looked like someone who had done this a lot. His gear was neat and laid out carefully, not like ours, which always ended up in a small pile until we figured out what we were doing. He had a dog with him too, a medium-sized mutt, short-haired, kind of golden-colored. It was just lying down next to his chair, panting a little in the heat but not tied up or fenced in. I remember thinking it was a good dog, quiet and calm, just keeping watch on its owner. I didn't think much more of them at the time. Mom made sandwiches for lunch, and we ate sitting at the picnic table, swatting flies and sipping lukewarm sodas from the cooler. Later in the afternoon, after it started to cool off, we decided to walk down to the river. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter-mile down a wide dirt path that cut past a few other campsites before narrowing into a little trail through tall grass and cottonwoods. On the way there, we passed that man's campsite again. His truck was parked with the driver's side door wide open, and his dog was sitting by the front bumper, same as before. I thought it was odd that the door was still open like that, but we just assumed maybe he was getting something or airing it out. The dog didn't bark or move, just looked at us calmly as we walked by. Its ears perked a little, but that was it. We didn't see the man anywhere, but again, we didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd gone to use the bathroom, or was just off in the woods collecting firewood or something. The river was shallow and slow-moving, wide in some places and narrowed by reeds and overhanging branches in others. We sat on a big rock for a while, just listening to the sound of the water and the wind in the leaves. I tossed a few stones in, watched the ripples spread out and fade. Mom closed her eyes and leaned back, soaking up the quiet. I remember there were dragonflies buzzing low over the surface of the water, and the sun was starting to dip just low enough that the light had that golden tint to it, making everything look softer. We didn't talk much. I just remember feeling calm, safe. I liked being outdoors with her like that. Eventually, we decided to head back to camp. As we got close to the older man's site again, I noticed the truck door was still open. That struck me as a little strange now, since it had been quite a while since we passed it on the way down. The dog hadn't moved either. It was still sitting in the same spot, almost exactly, like it hadn't budged at all, just facing forward, quiet and still. Its head turned slightly as we came up the path, but again, no barking, no tail wagging, just watching. The campsite looked otherwise untouched. Nothing knocked over or out of place, but it felt weird. Not wrong exactly, but not quite right either. Back at our site, Mom got a small fire going and started prepping for dinner. I helped her dig through the cooler for hot dogs and potato salad, and we sat by the fire as the sun went down, roasting food on sticks and sipping cans of root beer. Other than the occasional crackle of someone's fire or a distant laugh from another camper, it was pretty quiet. That's how I remember most of the evening. Normal, peaceful. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about that dog, how it hadn't moved, how the truck door was still wide open. It wasn't something I wanted to mention to Mom. I guess because I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing, or maybe I just didn't want to sound silly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. It wasn't until later, just after dark had fully settled in and we were cleaning up from dinner, that things changed. A vehicle came down the gravel access road into the campground, headlights bouncing off trees and scattering shadows across the ground. Pulled up not far from us and parked. We saw a couple people get out, one with a flashlight. I remember the beams sweeping across the area, pausing for a moment in the direction of the man's sight, then suddenly flashing back and forth quickly. More lights came on. Voices. Not loud ones, but serious, purposeful. We couldn't hear what they were saying at first, but we watched them from the shadows of our campsite. The way kids do when they know something's going on but don't understand what it is yet. Not long after, another vehicle pulled in, this one with markings. The sheriff's department. That's when things started to feel heavy, serious. Mom told me to stay put while she walked over, not far, just to the edge of our site to see what was happening. I stayed by the fire, poking at the coals with a stick, nervous now. The campsite where the man had been was lit up with flashlights and headlights. I could just barely see his dog still sitting there, just a silhouette now, but still in the same spot. More people arrived. Some had uniforms. One had a radio clipped to their vest that kept squawking quietly. I didn't see what they saw. I couldn't see him, not from where I was, not even when I strained to make out shapes between the vehicles and people. Eventually, Mom came back. She didn't say much, just told me we were going to sit tight for a while and not bother the people working. I could tell by her face that something was wrong, but she didn't want to scare me, so I didn't ask. I just sat there, feeling a weird mixture of fear and confusion and curiosity. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach feel cold, even when you're sitting next to a fire. It wasn't until the next morning that we found out what had happened. Someone, maybe a different camper who'd arrived later, had walked past and seen the man lying in front of his truck, just on the other side from the open door, partially shielded by the shadow of the cab. He'd been dead for hours. They weren't sure if it was a heart attack or something else, but they said there was no sign of struggle or foul play. He was just gone. Sitting there earlier in the day, alive and well, and then suddenly not. What got to me even then was the dog. That poor dog had just stayed there by the truck the whole time. Silent, unmoving, guarding his person, waiting. It hadn't barked. It hadn't run off. It had just stayed. We left later that day, packed up in the morning after a quiet breakfast. Mom didn't say much during the drive home, and neither did I. I kept thinking about that campsite, the truck with its door left open, the dog with its steady, unblinking eyes, the way we'd walked right past, maybe only 5 or 6 feet from where that man was lying on the ground, and hadn't seen a thing, hadn't even known. I think about it sometimes, not often, but when I do, it hits me in a way that's hard to describe. That feeling of being so close to something heavy, something final, and not realizing it at all. Just passing by with your eyes forward, thinking about the river or the sun or the quiet, while something irreversible sits just outside your field of view. But mostly, I think about the dog. I wonder what happened to him. I hope someone took him in, that he wasn't left behind or sent to a shelter. He was a good dog, you could tell. Loyal, quiet, the kind of dog that understands things even when people don't. That kind of loyalty, that kind of stillness, it sticks with you. Even now, years later, I can still see him there in my mind, sitting patiently in the dust beside the truck, watching us pass by as he stayed close to the man who had meant everything to him. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip into Hoosier National Forest. I had a couple days off, and after a rough few weeks at work, I just needed to be out in the woods. No cell signal, no people, no noise except for birds and leaves underfoot. I picked a remote spot on the map, about a 2-mile hike off the main trailhead, and planned to primitive camp for 1 night, maybe 2 if the weather held up. I parked my car at a gravel lot just before noon and shouldered my pack. The trail was barely marked, just a faint footpath weaving through tall trees and brush, the kind of place where you have to keep glancing back so you remember what the return looks like. The woods were thick but quiet. Leaves were starting to turn and fall, and that dry, sweet smell of autumn clung to the air. I took my time getting in. I had nowhere to be. About 2 hours later, I found a small clearing nestled between 2 low ridges. It wasn't marked, but it looked like someone had camped there before. There was a small, circular patch of blackened earth in the center, surrounded by stones. Someone's old fire pit, probably years old by the look of it. It was perfect. Flat ground, enough space to stretch a hammock, and thick brush around it to break the wind. I set up my hammock between 2 sturdy oaks and hung a tarp above it in case the forecast was wrong and the clouds rolled in overnight. I unpacked my small camp stove and a few things to cook. Just some instant rice, beans, and jerky, nothing fancy. It was around 6:30 when I got the fire going. The air had cooled fast, and everything around me had turned pale gold and orange in the setting sun. That kind of light makes the woods look soft, like someone smeared the edges of the trees with a thumb. I wasn't worried about nightfall. I had my headlamp, extra batteries, a compass, a lighter, and a map with a marked return route. I'd done this kind of thing plenty of times before, and honestly, I looked forward to the silence that comes when everything finally goes dark and still. I figured I'd eat, sip some water, maybe whittle a bit, and turn in early. Right as I stirred the rice and beans over the little fire, I realized I had to piss. I could have just stepped a few feet away, but I didn't want to go too close to where I was cooking. There was thick underbrush everywhere, but just to the left of my clearing was a small trail that led into some tall ferns and saplings. I figured I'd step in a few yards, get some privacy, and be back in a minute. I didn't take my headlamp or compass. Why would I? I was maybe 10 yards from camp. Tops. I stepped off into the brush, found a spot, took care of business, and zipped up. When I turned to head back, I couldn't find the clearing. It was like I'd spun around and forgotten which way I came in, which didn't make sense. I hadn't gone far. I looked for familiar shapes, my tarp, the trees with the hammock, the faint shape of the fire, but everything looked the same. It was all just dense brush and shadows and the low hum of insects settling in for the night. I moved in what I thought was the right direction. I kept my steps small, thinking I'd break through the brush and find my camp again within seconds. But nothing opened up. Just more trees, more thorns, more shadows. The firelight should have been visible through the trees, but it wasn't. The tarp was a bright blue, hard to miss even in dim light, but I didn't see that either. After a few minutes, my confidence started to crack. I stopped and stood still, trying to listen. Sometimes a fire pops, or you hear your own gear rustling in the breeze. I heard nothing that sounded familiar, just wind through branches and the distant creaking of tree trunks swaying against each other. I walked a little more, then more. 10 minutes passed, then maybe 20. Still nothing. That's when the panic really started to creep in. It gets dark fast in the woods once the sun drops, and I hadn't brought my headlamp with me. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my lighter, flicking it on for a second to get my bearings. It didn't help. The flame just lit up the brush around me and made everything beyond it look even darker. I flicked it off to save the fuel. I figured the smart thing to do was stop moving and try to retrace my steps. But the forest floor wasn't clear. There wasn't a worn path or broken branches to follow. Everything had been disturbed by my boots already, and the underbrush was so thick that nothing really left a clear trail. I circled the same small area over and over, trying to find something, anything, I recognized. I started calling out, not yelling, just loud enough that if someone had been nearby, they might have heard. But I already knew there wasn't anyone else around. I hadn't passed a single person on the hike in. I didn't expect help, but part of me hoped my voice might carry back to my own ears if I was close to camp. Didn't. By the time it got dark enough that I couldn't see my own boots without the lighter, I had to face the fact that I was well and truly lost. I pulled my phone out just to check if I got lucky with a signal. No service, no GPS, just the time, 8:41 p.m. That's when I realized how much time had already passed. I thought maybe an hour had gone by, not 3. My pulse picked up, and I felt cold despite the still air. I wasn't dressed for a long hike at night, just a light jacket over a t-shirt, hiking boots, thin socks. The brush had scratched up my arms and legs a bit, and I could feel sweat cooling on my back. I told myself I needed to calm down. People get lost. The worst thing you can do is panic and start moving faster. That's how people get hurt. I found a fallen log and sat on it for a while, staring up through the trees. The stars were bright, clearer than you ever see in town. It should have been peaceful, but my mind kept running in circles. Where the hell was I? How far had I gone? I couldn't believe I had just turned the wrong way and somehow missed my entire camp. After sitting still for maybe half an hour, I decided I had to move. I didn't want to spend the night out there with no shelter, and even if I walked in the wrong direction, I figured eventually I'd hit a trail or a road. So I started walking. The forest at night is a different thing entirely. Your senses stretch thin. Every rustle feels like an animal. Every snap of a twig makes your breath catch. I kept my lighter in hand, flicking it every few minutes just to make sure I wasn't about to walk into something. I didn't use it for long, just enough to get my bearings. I had to ration it. I pushed through thickets, climbed over logs, and scraped past thorns. At some point, my foot slipped on a mossy rock and I fell hard on my side. I lay there for a second, wind knocked out of me, cheek pressed into wet leaves. I didn't get up right away. I just stared into the dark, thinking, this is how people disappear. Not because of wild animals or some mystery, but because they take one wrong turn and then try to fix it. Eventually, I rolled over, sat up, and checked myself. My hip ached, and my hand had a small gash from the fall, but I was mostly okay. I kept walking. I didn't know how far I had gone until I saw it. White paint, faint lines along the edge of a tree trunk, like trail markings or property boundaries. And beyond that, more space between the trees. I moved faster. I wasn't sure what I was heading toward, but it felt like something different, which was enough. Finally, around 11:30, I broke out of the woods onto a gravel road. I stopped and just stared at it for a long time. Not a big road, just one lane, lined with thick trees on either side. But it was something. Civilization. A way back. I looked both directions. No lights. No houses, just silence. I had no idea which way to go, but I picked right and started walking. About a mile down, I recognized a wooden trail sign in the ditch. It wasn't the trailhead I came in from, but it was marked on the same map. That meant I could orient myself. I dug out the crumpled map from my jacket pocket, held it up to the faint starlight, and traced the lines with my fingers. I was nearly 2 miles from my camp. Somehow, I had circled in a wide, clumsy arc away from it. My few steps for privacy had turned into a 5-hour nightmare. I didn't go back that night. I followed the road until I hit a cross trail, found my way to the parking lot where I'd left the car, and slept in the back seat with the windows cracked. I came back early the next morning with my map and a compass, followed the trail in daylight, and found my camp exactly where I'd left it. Fire burnt down to coals, hammock still hanging, tarp rustling gently in the breeze. It looked like someone had just stepped away for a few minutes. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, half in disbelief. It had been right there, that close. I don't know how I missed it. I packed up and left that morning. I haven't been back to Hoosier since. What I learned from that night is this. Getting lost in the woods isn't some dramatic thing. It happens quietly, one step in the wrong direction. One assumption that you'll find your way back. No panic at first, just a little confusion. Then more. Then suddenly, you're standing in darkness 2 miles from where you're supposed to be with no clue how you got there. I was lucky. I had enough sense to stop, enough gear to get through, and enough light to keep moving. But I'll never again leave camp without a headlamp and compass, even if I'm just stepping 10 yards away, because 10 yards can turn into 2 miles. I'm not really the kind of person who camps much. I've got nothing against it, and I don't hate the outdoors or anything. It's just not something I usually do. Most of my weekends are spent at home, maybe out with a few friends, but mostly inside. Still, I've always had a soft spot for fishing. Something about it, the quiet, the still water, the slow rhythm of it all has always calmed me down. I hadn't gone in years though. Life gets busy, people drift, and I guess I just stopped making time for it. So when my friend reached out and said he was planning a quick overnight trip to a state park not too far from us, something casual, just some fishing, camping, and beers by the fire, I actually said yes without thinking too much. It felt like it had been forever since I'd done something like that, and I figured why not? One night out in nature wouldn't kill me. Plus, the idea of being out on a lake again with a rod in my hands just felt right. We packed light, just a tent, some snacks, fishing gear, and a couple of coolers. The park was about 2 hours out of town. Nothing remote or wild, just one of those large, forested state parks with a decent lake in the middle. Lots of families went there during the day, but since we were camping out during the week, we figured it would be mostly empty. When we arrived, the place was calm. A few people were packing up for the day as we got our stuff out of the car. The lake was beautiful, wide, still, and surrounded by tall trees on all sides. It was early afternoon, maybe just before 3, and the sun was still high in the sky. We checked in at the little ranger station, picked a decent campsite not too far from the lake, and headed over to the rental area to get a canoe. The plan was simple. Spend the afternoon out on the lake fishing, then head back before dark, set up camp, cook something simple, and hang out by the fire. The guy at the rental shack gave us a quick rundown on the canoe. It wasn't anything fancy, just a green metal canoe, wide and stable, with 2 paddles and 2 life vests. He told us to be back before dark if we weren't experienced. We weren't, but we also didn't want to come back early. The weather was perfect, and it felt good being out there. I told him we'd be careful. Once we got the canoe in the water and pushed off from the dock, I could feel a bit of the city fall away from my shoulders. The lake stretched out in all directions, quiet and calm. The trees wrapped around it like a wall, with small clearings along the shoreline where you could imagine deer might come down to drink or where someone had fished earlier in the day. We paddled out to the middle, then let ourselves drift while we cast out our lines. The fishing was slow, but we didn't mind. I caught 1 small bass that I let go, and my friend got a couple of nibbles that didn't stick. Most of the time we just sat quietly, letting the canoe sway gently with the movement of the water. There was a light breeze, and the air smelled of lake water and pine needles. Every now and then we heard birds call from the trees or the faint slap of a fish breaking the surface. It was the kind of calm that settles deep into your bones. We must have been out there for hours. The sun slowly lowered in the sky until the water turned a deep gold. The breeze died down. Shadows stretched long across the lake. I checked my phone and saw it was just after 7:30. The sun wasn't quite down yet, but it was heading that way fast, and we were a good distance from the dock. I reeled in my line and we started paddling back. Neither of us said much. The quiet had grown thick around us, the way it does just before night really sets in. I remember leaning back a little, just looking out across the surface of the lake, when something caught my eye. It was small, barely visible in the low light. 2 tiny pinpricks of red, like light reflectors. They were near the shoreline, half hidden by reeds or some kind of vegetation. My first thought was that someone had dumped an old bike there, and the reflectors had caught the last bit of sunlight. I pointed it out to my friend and told him what I thought, but he just kept paddling. I stared at the lights a while longer. They didn't move. I shrugged and figured it was just junk someone left behind. The world's full of that kind of stuff. The only thing that felt a little odd was that they seemed too low, too close to the surface of the water, like they were barely above it. But I let the thought go. Maybe the bike had sunk into the mud. We paddled on, and I lost sight of the lights. For a while, there was nothing but the creak of the paddles and the soft sound of water sliding past the canoe. I wasn't scared. Not then. Just tired and a little hungry. A few minutes passed, and I glanced back toward that same stretch of shoreline. That's when I saw them again. But this time there were 4 of them. I blinked. It was hard to make out clearly, but yeah, for glowing dots now, spaced in 2 sets. They were farther from the shore than before. I couldn't quite figure that part out. Maybe we'd drifted in closer to them without realizing. But it almost looked like they'd moved, and were now hovering just beneath the surface of the water, slowly keeping pace with us. My stomach did a small twist, but I shook it off. I told myself it had to be 2 bikes, maybe tied together or dumped at the same spot. Or maybe it was some kind of submerged equipment, buoys or lights someone had tied off for fishing. I kept looking, though unable to stop. Something didn't sit right. They were too symmetrical, too evenly spaced, and they stayed just far enough away to make me question myself. We kept paddling. The dock was still a ways off, and the light was really fading now. The gold had turned to a bluish gray, and the water no longer reflected the sky. It just looked black. Every tree on the shore had turned into a jagged silhouette. The warmth of the day was draining out fast, and I started to feel cold sweat on my lower back even though the air wasn't that chilly yet. I looked over my shoulder one more time, trying to spot those lights again. And I did. This time, they were unmistakably closer. Still 4 of them. Still low to the water. Still spaced the same. But now they were maybe 20 or 30 feet from the canoe, maybe even less. I could feel them behind us, feel the presence of something there. I turned to my friend and pointed them out again. He glanced back, paused for just a second, then gave a kind of nod and kept rowing. He didn't say anything. That silence was somehow worse than if he'd laughed it off. His shoulders stiffened, his pace quickened slightly. I felt my throat tighten. He knew something I didn't. We didn't stop. We just kept rowing until the dock came into view. As soon as the canoe touched the wood, I hopped out and grabbed the rope to tie it off. My hands were shaking slightly, and I still didn't know why. I turned around, half expecting to see those 4 red dots right behind us. But the lake was empty. The surface was still and quiet. We pulled the canoe up onto shore, returned the paddles, and made our way back to the campsite in silence. The trail back was short, maybe 10 minutes, but every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush had my head snapping around. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the usual noises of the forest at night, but my nerves were still stretched thin. When we finally got back to the campsite, the fire pit was empty, and the woods around us had gone completely dark. We set up the tent in silence, and it wasn't until everything was done and we were sitting by the fire that my friend finally said what he'd been holding in. He told me those lights weren't reflectors. He said he didn't want to say anything on the water because he was afraid I'd panic or rock the canoe. What I thought were bike reflectors were actually eyes. 2 sets. Alligators. They'd been following us. He'd seen them not long after I did, maybe even before. He'd watched them slowly drift along behind us, staying just far enough back to be hard to make out, but close enough to keep pace. He'd hoped they'd lose interest or that we'd reach the shore before anything happened, but they never stopped following. Hearing him say it out loud made my skin crawl. I'd grown up in the city. I didn't know much about alligators beyond what you see on TV, but I'd always imagined they were slow, maybe lazy. Hearing that 2 of them had silently tailed us across open water like that, just beneath the surface, completely unnoticed, it made me feel small and exposed in a way I hadn't felt before. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every crackle of the fire, every whisper of wind in the trees, made my heart jump. I kept picturing those 4 red dots floating in the darkness, always just behind us, waiting. We didn't stay the second night. The plan had been to hang out for a full day, maybe fish a little more in the morning before heading back. But by sunrise, we'd packed everything up. The canoe stayed on shore. Neither of us said it, but we both knew we weren't going back out there. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how quiet they had been, how close they must have come. If we'd stopped to fish just a little longer, if we'd dropped something and reached into the water, if the boat had tipped even slightly, there were 100 tiny decisions that could have ended differently. I still like fishing, but I haven't gone again since that trip. I tell myself it's just because I've been busy, but deep down I know it's something else. It's the memory of those red eyes floating in the dusk, the silence of the water, the realization that something was watching us the whole way back, and we never even knew. And that's what stuck with me. Not the fear, not even the alligators. When I was 16, I signed up for one of those wilderness adventure trips you find in the back of outdoor magazines and summer camp catalogs. Think Outward Bound or something like it. My parents had been pushing me to do something active and transformative over the summer, and honestly, I kind of wanted it too. I wanted to get away, to do something hard, to feel like I'd really earned the end of summer, instead of just wasting it like I had the year before. So I picked the program with the longest trip. 25 days through a national park I'd never even heard of, filled with hiking, river crossings, setting up camps, and basically surviving out in the woods with a dozen other kids and a couple of wilderness instructors. The trip started with a 3-day base camp setup near the trailhead. We'd spend those first few days getting used to the gear, going on day hikes, and learning the rules of backcountry safety, especially about bears. They drilled it into us from the start. Never keep anything scented in your tent. That didn't just mean snacks. It included sunscreen, toothpaste, deodorant, chapstick, lotion. Literally anything that had a smell. If it smelled like something you'd put in your mouth or on your body, it had to go in the bear bag. The bear bags were these big nylon sacks we'd all hang together from a tall branch at least a mile away from the tents every night. You had to hike out with it, hoist it into a tree using a pulley system or just some strong rope, and then hike back in. It was a pain, especially when you were exhausted at the end of a long day. But they made it clear, skipping this step could get you killed. The bears weren't just stories. They were real. They had no fear of humans, and if you messed up, it wasn't just your life you were risking, it was everyone else's too. The first night went smoothly. Everyone was nervous, but also buzzing with the energy of being out there. You could hear the insects, the wind rustling through the trees, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the brush, probably a rabbit or a raccoon. Everyone triple-checked their bear bags and made sure nothing was left in their tents. The instructors even inspected some of our gear just to be sure. The second night felt a little more relaxed. We were getting used to things, how to set up camp, how to cook with the little stoves, how to dig cat holes for using the bathroom. That night, I lay awake for a little while, just listening. I was in my sleeping bag, staring up through the mesh top of my tent, watching the faint outline of trees swaying against the sky. You could see a few stars, but the moon hadn't come up yet. It was peaceful, almost enough to forget how far we were from everything and how vulnerable we really were out there. Then came the third night. That afternoon, we'd passed a few other groups as we hiked to a nearby lake and back. Groups from other programs doing similar trips. The instructors always waved and exchanged brief hellos, just enough to recognize that we weren't alone out there, even though it felt like it most of the time. One group was camped maybe a 15 or 20-minute walk down the trail from us, which in the wilderness felt like neighbors. I think they were from a different organization, maybe one of the local ones. They looked younger than us. Some of them might have been 13 or 14. After dinner that night, we did the bear bag ritual like always. One of the instructors walked with us to the drop point and watched as we tied everything up. We joked around a little, talked about how sore our feet were, who had the worst blisters, that sort of thing. Then we hiked back, brushed our teeth, and settled in for the night. It must have been a little after 3 in the morning when I woke up. I didn't hear anything at first. It was more like my body woke up on its own. Some part of me on alert even though I was still half asleep. I lay there, not moving, not breathing too loudly, just listening. Then I heard the noise. It was distant, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't wind or an animal or anything normal. It was screaming. It wasn't the loud, movie-type screaming. It was panicked, choked, muffled by distance but still carrying clearly through the cold air. Then came a crashing sound, like something big was moving through trees fast, something breaking branches and stomping through brush. The screams stopped for a few seconds, then started again, shorter and more ragged this time. Then silence. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I could barely move. My fingers were shaking so bad I couldn't even unzip the bag. I didn't want to move anyway. I didn't want to make a sound. My mouth was dry, and I remember the strange buzzing in my head like my brain was trying to catch up to what my ears had just heard. From the tent next to mine, I heard someone else shift around. A zipper slid open slowly, but no one said anything. Nobody wanted to speak, not even a whisper. We were all frozen. The instructors were up. I didn't see them, but I could hear the crunch of boots as they walked around camp slowly, carefully. They weren't talking either. I could hear one of them stop a few feet from my tent and just stand there, like he was listening to the woods, waiting to hear if anything else was coming. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the faint light of dawn began to show behind the trees. The instructors finally gathered everyone. We were all wide-eyed, pale, silent. Nobody had slept since the screaming started. Some people looked like they hadn't moved an inch from their sleeping bags. That's when we found out what happened. About 7 or 8 campgrounds down, a kid had snuck candy into his tent. Skittles. That was it. He probably thought it was harmless. Just a little sugar before bed. Probably thought nobody would notice. But the bear noticed. It ripped through his tent sometime in the early morning and mauled him. Killed him before anyone could even react. The others in his group had woken up to the sounds just like we had, but by the time help got there, There was nothing they could do. The bear had already run off. Rangers came in helicopters a few hours later. Word spread fast. News crews, emergency crews. It made national news. We were told to call our parents. The instructors lined us up at a sat phone one by one and had us each tell our folks that we were okay, that we were safe, that we'd heard what happened, but we weren't hurt. I remember my mom crying over the phone. I could barely talk to her. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't even sure I believed I was okay. After that, we still had 2 nights left at the same campsite. They gave us the choice to pull out, but most of us stayed. I think some of us didn't want to look scared, or maybe we didn't want to go back home knowing a kid had just died and we couldn't handle it. Maybe it felt like staying would prove something to ourselves. But I can tell you now, those were the worst 2 nights of my life. I didn't sleep at all the 4th night. Not 1 minute. I lay completely still in my bag, listening to every sound, every creak of a branch, every gust of wind. I'd jump at the tiniest noise. My hands clenched around my flashlight like that would save me. I didn't even turn it on. I was too scared it would attract something. I imagined that bear coming into our camp. I imagined it sniffing at my tent, pawing at the side, trying to get in. I kept thinking about what it must have felt like to be that kid, knowing it was coming, not being able to run, not being able to stop it, just trapped. By morning, I felt sick. I hadn't eaten breakfast. I hadn't even gotten out of my tent until the sun was fully up. I didn't want to walk alone. I didn't want to go to the latrine. I didn't want to do anything but pack up and leave. But we didn't leave. The program went on. The instructors tried to act like it was fine, that we were still safe. But they had bear spray on their belts now. Before, it had been in their packs. Now it was on their hips. The 5th night wasn't much better. I slept maybe an hour or 2, drifting in and out. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those screams again. Not exactly the sound, but the memory of it. I'd startle awake, breathing hard, clutching my flashlight, checking the tent zipper again and again. I was too afraid to leave the tent to pee, so I held it until morning. My legs were cramped, and my back was sore from sleeping so stiff, like I was trying to stay small in case something passed by. When we finally moved on from that site, I felt like I could breathe again. But the fear didn't go away. Not completely. For the rest of the trip, we were extra cautious. We double-checked our bags. We rehung bear bags 2 or 3 times a night. We never walked alone. We slept lighter. And even then, I don't think any of us fully relaxed until we were back in town. By the end of the 25 days, I'd learned a lot about hiking, cooking, teamwork, and surviving in the woods. But none of that compared to what I'd learned that 3rd night. That a single mistake, 1 little bag of candy, can cost a life. The kid who died was just trying to enjoy something sweet before bed. He probably didn't think twice about it. Maybe he hid it because he didn't want it taken away. Maybe he thought the warnings were overblown. That's how teenagers think sometimes. I might have thought the same thing if I hadn't been so scared of bears from the start. But he paid the price for it. And I'll never forget that. When I got home, I couldn't explain it right to people. Everyone asked if it was scary, and I said yeah, but that didn't come close to describing it. It wasn't the kind of scary that comes and goes. It was the kind that gets into your bones. The kind you carry with you even after the trip ends. Even now, years later, I can't eat. Two winters ago, I decided to go on my first solo camping trip in Pennsylvania. I had been on a few hikes before and had explored the trail near the Holtwood Dam. But this time, I planned to go deeper, away from the crowds, and truly experience the solitude. I had hiked the first few miles of the trail before, but this time, I planned on pushing a bit further, seeing how far I could go and maybe camping somewhere more remote. I had my dog with me for company, and that always made me feel a little more secure, especially when I was venturing out alone. The day I set off started off nice. The weather had been fairly mild for winter, just a chill in the air, but not so cold that it made everything unbearable. The kind of cold that gives you a fresh breath of air, sharp and clean. I packed my gear carefully the night before and checked it twice to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything important. I was hoping this would be an experience that I could look back on and feel accomplished. The first few miles felt like nothing, a repeat of what I'd done before. The trail wasn't too difficult, though it did get a little steeper as I headed deeper into the woods. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches stretching out in all directions, the ground covered in a crunchy layer of leaves and frost. There's something about winter camping that makes everything feel a bit more isolated. The world seems quieter, almost hushed, like nature itself is holding its breath. Around mile 6, I encountered something strange. Off the side of the trail, barely visible through the trees, was a house. It wasn't much, just a small, old home. No driveway, no clear path leading to it, just sitting there like a forgotten relic in the woods. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. Felt wrong, out of place. I wasn't interested in poking around it, so I kept walking, keeping my eyes forward. I wasn't about to head any closer to that house, especially as the day started slipping into dusk. I hiked on for another couple of miles, and eventually, I came across a small clearing, a nice spot to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and I figured it was as good a place as any. The forest around me had an eerie stillness to it, but the spot seemed safe enough. I started setting up my tent, my dog pacing around me, sniffing the air as usual. I could feel the temperature dropping already, and I wanted to get everything set up before the dark really took hold. There was something about being out in the woods alone that always made me a little more cautious, a little more aware of my surroundings. I worked quickly, securing the tent and laying out my gear. By the time everything was ready, the last bit of sunlight was gone, and the world around me was dimming into a dark, starless sky. I started a small fire, careful to keep it low, so it wouldn't attract too much attention. The flickering flames cast strange shadows on the trees, and the crackling of the wood was the only sound that filled the air. I cooked up a simple dinner, something quick and easy, not wanting to waste too much time on food. After eating, I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the hike, and quickly fell asleep. The night was silent, the kind of silence you only get when you're deep in the woods, far from any roads or civilization. The kind that makes you realize just how alone you are. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet, almost unnaturally so. I didn't think much of it at first. I had camped out in isolated places before, but this felt different. I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way the wind barely stirred the trees, or how the fire seemed to fade too quickly into the night. But eventually, my eyes closed, and I drifted off. It wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a sound outside my tent. The crunching of footsteps on the frozen earth. Heavy, deliberate steps, closer and closer, like someone was walking right up to my campsite. My dog, who had been sleeping curled up beside me, suddenly stood up and started growling. It wasn't a playful growl or the kind he did when he heard something harmless. No, this was different. This was a growl that came from deep in his chest, low and menacing. He stood rigid, his hackles raised, eyes wide and fixed on the tent wall as if he could see through it. My heart started pounding in my chest. Every muscle in my body went stiff, and I held my breath, trying to listen, trying to figure out what was going on. The footsteps outside continued, slow and steady, like someone walking around my camp, taking their time. The air felt heavier somehow, thicker, pressing in from all sides. I lay still, hoping whatever was out there would just leave. But then it happened again, crunch, crunch, closer this time, like someone was circling the tent. My dog's growling grew louder, more frantic. I whispered to him to settle down, but he wasn't listening. His growls turned into a low whine, and he backed up toward me, still keeping his eyes fixed on the tent entrance. I tried to steady my breathing, to calm my racing mind. It wasn't uncommon to hear animals at night, but this felt different, too deliberate, too human-like in the pacing, like someone was out there intentionally trying to make noise. My brain raced through all the possibilities. Maybe it was another camper, someone out here for the night, but who would be hiking this deep into the woods at this time of night? The footsteps stopped, complete silence. My heart thudded loudly in my ears. I could feel the weight of the air around me, the tension thickening as I waited. I listened intently, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. I could hear my dog's rapid breathing beside me, could feel the heat from his body pressing against me, but nothing came. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Then, out of nowhere, the crunching started again, this time much closer, right outside the tent. I could feel the presence of something, or someone, just inches away, on the other side of the thin fabric. My dog let out a sharp bark, and I quickly grabbed his collar, pulling him down to keep him quiet. The footsteps continued, as if whoever or whatever was out there was circling, testing, waiting for something. A shiver ran down my spine as I strained to hear, but all I could focus on was the oppressive silence surrounding me. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness, every rustling in the trees, every crackling twig. The temperature inside the tent had dropped significantly, and my breath started fogging up the fabric. I lay there, still as could be, trying to keep my panic in check. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be someone out here looking for something? A hiker, or worse, a hunter? I thought back to the house I'd passed earlier. Had someone from that house followed me? Or maybe it was just some animal wandering through. I tried to calm myself, but the uncertainty gnawed at me, and the growing feeling of being watched never left. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching longer than the last. I couldn't sleep, couldn't close my eyes without imagining what might be out there. Every time I thought the footsteps had gone away, they started up again, closer, louder. It was as if whatever was out there was waiting for something, maybe for me to make a move. But I didn't. I lay there, too afraid to do anything but wait for the sunrise. Eventually, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the sounds stopped. Just like that, silence. No footsteps, no crunching in the snow or leaves. My dog stopped growling and settled down again, but I could feel his tension in the way he stayed close to me. The sun's light slowly started to creep into the woods, and with it came a sense of relief. I had survived the night, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out what had been out there. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up as quickly as I could. I barely even made coffee that morning. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. My heart was still racing, and every crackling leaf or snap of a twig sent a fresh wave of dread through me. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to see anything lingering on the trail. I made my way back to the trailhead, retracing the steps I had taken the day before. The hike out felt longer, even though it was mostly downhill. The morning was eerily quiet, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had risen fully, and I could finally breathe. My heart had settled, though the nerves hadn't quite left. I threw my pack into my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if someone had been watching me, or if it was just the way the night played tricks on my mind. All I know is that I didn't feel safe out there anymore. Whatever it was, it had made sure I wouldn't forget that night. I haven't been back to that trail since. It's hard to explain, but something about that place, that night, just doesn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the house I passed earlier. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the fact that I'd been alone out there, completely vulnerable, and the woods had a way of showing that. But I do know one thing for sure. I'll be sticking to more populated trails from now on. And I'll never, ever It was supposed to be an easy drive home, just 4 or 5 hours on the highway after a long holiday. We had the Yaris packed full, bags wedged in the trunk, shoes on the backseat floor, jackets bundled up under our legs. My wife was behind the wheel for the first half, and I was doing my usual job of staring out the window, trying to keep myself awake. We were maybe 2 hours in, and the road was dull in the worst way. Endless concrete, the same cars passing or being passed, same green overhead signs, the same trees on either side. That slow-motion highway boredom. That's when we decided to get off the main road and take an alternate route through the back roads. Just for the hell of it. We were in no rush to get home, and we figured we'd see some small towns. Maybe stop somewhere and grab something to eat. Take a couple photos. The GPS was a few years out of date, but it still worked fine for stuff like this. We trusted it. The first turnoff took us through a decent-sized town. At least it seemed that way on approach. Rows of houses, a few commercial buildings, maybe a school. But it was a Sunday, and everything was shut down tight. No one walking around, no open shops, nothing. Just closed doors and drawn blinds. Like the whole town had packed up and vanished. The GPS rerouted a few times, but we weren't worried. It was clear we were still heading roughly in the direction we needed to. But the farther we drove, the more everything started to thin out. One town turned into a village, and then into scattered houses, and then into what looked like forest reserve. By now, clouds had rolled in and the sky was getting darker. It wasn't quite dusk yet, but you could tell it was coming. And then the rain started. We passed through what must have been the smallest town I've ever seen. Maybe 8 houses in total, a few with rusted swing sets in the yard, some with plastic chairs tipped over on porches, one with a boat sitting up on a trailer in tall grass. We saw no people, not a single one. It wasn't creepy exactly, just off. There was a quietness to it, like it had been quiet for a long time. That's when we noticed the fuel gauge. I hadn't been paying attention, assuming we'd refuel at the next town. But now we realized we'd gone nearly an hour without seeing a single open petrol station. The tank was close to empty, not redline empty, but definitely low enough that it made my chest tighten. We told ourselves we'd find one soon. We had to. The GPS, still chugging away despite the lack of signal, suggested a route back toward the highway. It pointed us toward a road that cut through a national park. It was a dirt road, but from the satellite view it looked well maintained. We figured if it meant cutting a bit of time and getting us back toward a bigger town, it was worth it. As soon as we hit the dirt, we were surprised by how smooth it was. Laser flat, no potholes, not even much mud despite the steady rain. For the first 10 minutes, it was honestly a relief. Trees on either side, but spaced far enough apart that we could still see the gray sky. We even started to relax again, laughing a bit at how stupid we were for letting the tank get so low. That didn't last long. As the road started winding uphill, the fuel dropped faster. We had to keep the foot down harder to climb, and the Yaris, already not built for this kind of thing, started to strain. We were way up by then, far enough that when I looked behind us, the last glimpse of town had vanished completely. Another 20 minutes of driving and the GPS told us to turn right. We did, and instantly regretted it. The road it wanted us to follow wasn't a road. It was 2 tire ruts pressed into wet grass, deep enough that the center was raised and slick with rainwater. We hesitated, but we also didn't think we could afford to backtrack. If we burned more fuel going back down the mountain and didn't find anything, we'd be stranded anyway. So we turned in. The car dipped into the ruts, and the tires immediately began to spin a bit before catching again. We held our breath as we crept forward. The trees here were thicker, and the rain was coming down harder, splattering against the windshield and running in streaks. Every so often the tires would slip slightly sideways before correcting. I didn't say anything, but I could feel every part of my body tightening up. We had no signal, no idea where we actually were. The GPS showed a line going forward, but it wasn't showing any more towns or intersections, just one solid path. Eventually, the rutted trail opened up into a clearing. Rough grass, maybe 30 feet across. The forest surrounded us on all sides. The GPS told us to turn left, but there was nothing there. No path, no trail, no indication that anyone had ever driven that way. Just grass and trees. I panned ahead on the GPS map, trying to see where it thought this road was leading. I kept scrolling and scrolling, but there was nothing. No highway ahead, no junction, not even a marked landmark. Just a line continuing into the green blur of the national park. We sat there for a few seconds, staring out at the clearing. The rain was coming down harder now. It was almost dark. The low light made the forest look closer than it really was. I opened the door and stepped out into ankle-deep wet grass. Water immediately soaked through my shoes and socks. I walked forward, just enough to check if maybe we'd missed a turn or some hidden trail. There was nothing. No signs, no tracks. It was obvious no one had been through here in years. We needed to turn back. Getting the car turned around in that space was awkward, but we managed it. 3-point turn, slow and careful, the tires fighting to keep traction in the slippery grass. Now we were facing back down the rutted path. The angle wasn't steep, but it was enough. My wife gently tapped the accelerator. The tires spun. Not forward, not backward, just sideways. The car didn't move an inch ahead. It just started sliding, barely at first, then a little more, just enough to make the back end drift toward the edge of the clearing. There was an embankment, maybe 6 feet down. If we slipped, we'd end up tilted or worse, stuck. She let off the gas and tried again, even slower. Same result. As soon as the wheels started moving, the car lost its grip and slid sideways again. I got out and tried to figure out what the ground was like behind the car. It was mostly just slick grass over clay, maybe. No gravel, nothing solid. It had rained long enough that the top layer was just grease. I tried shoving down some sticks, anything for traction. Didn't help. We didn't speak. There was no point. The options were obvious. Either we stayed stuck here all night or I pushed. I braced myself behind the car and told her to go as gently as possible. Just tap the pedal. The tires spun, and immediately the car slipped sideways again. I pushed harder. It moved an inch forward, then another. I slipped and slammed my knee against the bumper. Mud was up past my ankles, the rain running down the back of my neck, down my shirt. The exhaust burned against my thigh, but I kept pushing. It took nearly 10 minutes of inch-by-inch pushing, the wheels spinning and sliding and gripping just enough for us to make it to a point where the incline wasn't as bad. From there, the car finally started creeping forward under its own power. I jogged behind it until she reached a more level patch of dirt and stopped. I was soaked. Mud in my shoes, on my legs, under my fingernails. My hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. For a few seconds back there, I'd been certain the car was going to tip or slide over, and I'd get crushed or trapped or worse. We were more than 20 kilometers from anything. No signal, and we hadn't seen another car since the highway. We retraced our path in silence. Down the dirt road, back toward the village. Every bump and rut felt sharper now, like the car had less cushion. Or maybe I was just more alert. We finally hit pavement again and rolled slowly through the 8-house town. That's when I noticed it. The general store. It had been there the whole time, but in our earlier rush and focus on the GPS, we hadn't even seen it. Small and squat, a wooden sign over the door, and more importantly, 2 petrol Bozers out front. We pulled in like we were afraid it would vanish. The lights were on inside, dim and yellow, and the front door was open. There was a bell above it that rang softly when we stepped in. We didn't talk much, just filled the tank to the brim and grabbed anything remotely useful, water, snacks, even a plastic tarp just in case. I think we spent something like $160, and I'd have gladly spent twice that. The relief was unreal. Just being around walls and light and hearing the hum of a fridge and the clunk of our shoes on linoleum. It reminded me how deep the tension had gotten without me even noticing. We sat in the car outside the store for a few minutes after. The rain had eased up. The trees weren't so dark now. I could hear frogs in the distance, maybe a stream. It was only then that I let myself breathe. Really breathe. We'd made it. We weren't going to spend the night stuck in the middle of a forest in the rain. We weren't going to run out of fuel in some forgotten corner of nowhere. We got back on the road with the tank full, the GPS reset, and the highway marked clearly ahead. The drive the rest of the way was uneventful. Just quiet stretches of open road, a few trucks, and the glow of My mom, my sister, and I were on a camping trip that summer. It wasn't really about camping, at least not in the beginning. The real reason we were traveling was that my sister had a UIL competition coming up in North Dakota. My mom figured we might as well make a trip out of it. You know, something memorable. So we started working our way north, stopping at state parks and campgrounds along the route. It was supposed to be fun and educational, one of those summer bonding things. We weren't exactly a camping family, not hardcore or anything, but we'd done it a few times before, enough to feel like we knew the basics. We had a decent tent, some gear, an old ice chest that barely held cold for more than a day, and a slightly dented camp stove my mom insisted still worked fine, even though it only lit half the time. Minnesota was where things started to feel weird. We pulled into this campground near a big forest preserve. I don't even remember the exact name, just that it was surrounded by towering trees. Huge, old ones with limbs that stretched high overhead like the ceiling of a cathedral. It was quiet and pretty, the air cooler than it had been further south. You could hear birds calling all the time, from every direction, echoing through the trees. The air was thick with pine and the smell of damp earth. I remember stepping out of the car and thinking, okay, this might actually be kind of cool. At check-in, they handed out some flyers with campground rules and wildlife safety tips. One line stood out. It said something like, use caution while walking or biking near large trees. Birds have been known to swoop aggressively, and in some cases may strike campers on the head. That sounded insane. My sister even laughed out loud when she read it, but the woman handing out the papers didn't laugh. She just said, we've had incidents, and moved on to the next family. The first night was uneventful, just damp and a little boring. I slept fine, tucked into my sleeping bag on the tent floor, while my sister and mom both used their air mattresses. They'd only brought 2, and when I asked if I could share, they both told me no. I was younger, probably 8 or 9 at the time, small for my age, but not small enough to squeeze in comfortably between either of them, I guess. So I slept on the floor, which was lined with just a thin tarp and my sleeping bag. Not exactly warm, but bearable. The rain started during the second night. It didn't come down all at once, just a slow drizzle at first, kind of rhythmic and soothing in a way. But then, around midnight, it picked up hard. It hammered the tent like pebbles from the sky. Water started to seep in around the corners of the floor. I could feel the cold creeping up through the tarp, damp soaking into my sleeping bag, pressing into my back and sides. The floor wasn't perfectly flat either, so water pooled in certain areas. Of course, I had the unlucky spot. By 2 a.m., I was soaked. I shifted a few times, trying to find a dry patch, but there wasn't one. My hair stuck to my forehead, and the fabric of the bag clung to my clothes like wet paper. Every time I moved, it made a gross slurping sound. My mom and sister were still asleep, mostly dry and curled up on their mattresses. I sat up and looked at them. I even considered waking one of them and asking again if I could crawl in, but I already knew the answer. I felt this weird mix of anger and sadness, like I didn't really belong in that tent with them, like I was just along for the ride. Then I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path that led past our campsite. Then they stopped right at our tent flap. My heart started racing. I didn't say anything, just held my breath. I could hear water dripping from the edge of the rainfly, hitting the ground in fast, heavy splats. A zipper opened, and I saw a flashlight beam sweep across the inside of the tent. My mom bolted upright instantly. I recognized the man. It was one of the park rangers. He had the same tan uniform, same wide-brimmed hat, though it was dripping wet and sagging slightly from the rain. He didn't step in. He just crouched down and spoke in a low, calm voice, giving us a weather warning. Severe weather was coming through, he said. Really bad. He recommended we pack up and head to the storm shelter, which was a fortified building near the main parking lot, maybe a 10-minute walk away. Said it was built to handle tornado-force winds. I remember his face as he looked past my mom, right at me. He paused for a second, just a second, but it said a lot. It was this kind of unspoken thing, like he was asking, "You sure you're staying out here with a kid like that?" My mom hesitated but told him we were staying. I couldn't hear her exact words over the rain, but I saw her shake her head. The ranger gave us instructions anyway, just in case. Told us how to get to the shelter, wished us good luck, and zipped the flap back up. Then he was gone, back into the rain. I didn't fall asleep after that. I was shivering hard by then. Not little trembles, big, full body shakes I couldn't control. My muscles were sore from holding tight all night. Finally, maybe because of the ranger or maybe because she felt bad, my mom let me crawl onto her air mattress. It was a tight squeeze, but I didn't care. felt like heaven compared to the wet floor. She pulled her blanket over me, and I burrowed in, teeth chattering. But I didn't get warm. Not really. The cold had gotten in deep by that point. I just lay there shaking, listening to the storm. At some point, I heard the whistle. It was loud, unnaturally loud. Not like a person whistling, but a long, high-pitched screech that cut through the storm. The whole tent shook with it, like it was caught in a gust of wind that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I heard the poles creak, the rain fly flap hard like it was about to tear off. The sound rose and fell, dragged on for what felt like a full minute. Then it was gone. Just rain again, pounding and steady. My sister muttered something in her sleep, and my mom shifted beside me, but neither of them woke fully. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slowly. The tent was a wreck. Water had soaked through almost everything. My sleeping bag was still drenched, and the bottom corners of the tent held little puddles of muddy water. We stepped outside into ankle-deep mud. The whole campground looked like it had been beaten with a hammer. Twigs and small branches were scattered everywhere. Leaves blanketed the ground. A nearby tree had cracked at the top and was leaning awkwardly against another. I saw other campers packing up early, looking around and shaking their heads. When we got to the main office to check out, we heard the full story. A tornado had touched down just outside the forest preserve. Not a direct hit, but close enough to be serious. Trees had come down further up the ridge, and a few remote cabins had taken damage. One family's trailer had been flipped. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but it was a mess. Emergency crews had come in early that morning to help clear roads and check power lines. That terrible whistle we heard? That was the tornado. It had passed just far enough away not to take us with it, but we'd still felt the force of it in the air. My mom went pale when she heard the news. She didn't say much, just nodded and kept her arms crossed, her jaw tight. I could tell she was kicking herself for not taking the ranger's advice. I think she expected people to judge her, but nobody said anything. A lot of campers hadn't gone to the shelter. Maybe it was pride, or maybe they just didn't think it would get that bad. We left that place in a hurry. Didn't even stay to make breakfast. Just tossed everything wet into the trunk and back seat and hit the road. My sister kept trying to joke about it, saying how we'd survived a tornado and lived to tell the tale. She even said she'd write about it in one of her UIL essays. My mom didn't laugh. She just kept her eyes on the road. Me? I sat in the back seat, bundled up in one of the dry blankets we found at the bottom of the gear pile. I looked out the window and watched the trees go by, those same huge trees that had towered over us just the day before. Some of them had broken limbs now. Others had fallen over entirely. It was surreal to see them like that, giants brought down in the night. I don't remember where we camped next. Probably somewhere in North Dakota or just over the border. But I never forgot that night. The cold, the fear, the whistle, the ranger's face. The sound of the tent shaking like it was going to rip apart around me. How alone I felt on that wet floor, listening to the sky tear itself open. I still don't like thunderstorms. I'll sit through them, but deep down I get that same tight feeling in my chest every time I hear the wind howl. We laugh about it now, mostly. My mom always says she should have gone to the shelter, that it would have saved us a night of stress and soaked sleeping bags. She says it like a joke, but there's regret behind it. And she's right. It would have been safer. Warmer, too. I don't blame her, not really. None of us knew it would get that bad. But Minnesota? I'll never camp there again. Between the giant birds and the tornadoes and the mosquitoes the size of raisins with wings, I'm good. One trip was enough. It was one of those nights at camp when everything seemed to be under a thick blanket of silence. The kind of quiet where the air feels heavier, and every crackling leaf or shifting branch stands out like a shout in an empty room. The moon hung high above, casting pale, silver light over everything, so bright that we didn't need a flashlight to see the road clearly. The campfire was out, the kids were asleep in their tents, and everything felt still, almost too still. I was walking back with Jeremy, another staff member, carrying 2 garbage bags full of leftover s'mores wrappers, graham crackers, marshmallow goo, and other bits of food that the kids had left behind. The ranger had warned us about the bears in the area, said they'd been getting a little too curious about the camp. He asked us to be extra cautious with the food. We were walking down the dirt road, which snaked through the thick woods, making its way to the trash bins. It was a good 15-minute walk from the camp, far enough that we were out of sight from the tents. Jeremy and I had grown used to walking out here in the dark over the past few days, so we didn't bother with flashlights. The full moon gave us plenty of light to navigate the path, and honestly, it felt kind of nice. Everything seemed fine, quiet, too quiet. We dropped off the first load of garbage bags and were walking back when I heard something. A soft plucking sound, the kind of lazy rhythm you'd expect from someone playing an acoustic guitar. The tune was slow, and honestly, it sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. A little off, like it was too perfect for the setting. It wasn't loud, but the sound echoed off the trees and sent a strange shiver down my spine. "Jeremy, do you hear that?" I whispered, but I already knew he did. His posture had changed too, stiff and alert, like a deer hearing a twig snap in the woods. Jeremy didn't say anything, but I could feel him pulling up close to me. We both slowed our pace. The music was faint, but it was unmistakable. "Someone's out there?" he muttered, almost to himself. "I guess so," I replied. "Could be a camper, maybe." We kept walking, but the song lingered in the air. It was eerily calm and unsettling, like it didn't belong out here in the woods at this hour. It wasn't like someone had their amp cranked up, but the sound was distinct enough that we couldn't just brush it off. After all, the camp was a few miles from the nearest town, and cell service was non-existent out here. We had nothing but the campfire's glow and the moon's light to see by. As we kept walking, the music stopped abruptly. It was like the song had been cut off mid-chord, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything, and it felt like the woods around us had just swallowed up all the noise. Then, from our left, we heard something else. A sound coming through the brush, like something heavy moving through the undergrowth. I froze, holding my breath. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Jeremy didn't answer. Instead, I saw him take a step back, slowly, like he didn't want to make any more noise. His eyes were wide, scanning the trees, and I could see the tension in his body. We both stood there for a moment, waiting, listening. The sound of something moving was getting closer, coming right toward us. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel a sweat starting to bead at my brow despite the cool night air. I thought of the ranger's warning. Bears. What if it was a bear? The brush rustled loudly now, and whatever was out there wasn't being subtle. The sound was getting too close, too real. I didn't even know what to expect, but my brain was already racing, trying to figure out what the hell we were supposed to do. Then, like something straight out of a nightmare, a figure emerged from the darkness, just a few feet ahead of us. A man, holding an acoustic guitar, looking as calm as if he were sitting on his front porch. Behind him was a massive black dog, at least the size of a bear cub. The dog's fur was thick, and its eyes glinted in the moonlight, glowing faintly as it stood silently beside the man. My heart skipped a beat. I was still processing what I was seeing when Jeremy spoke first. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, stepping back another few feet. He clearly wasn't as calm about this as the man seemed to be. The man didn't acknowledge us right away, just kept strumming his guitar. He had that unbothered air of someone who had no clue they were completely out of place. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, and his jeans looked worn, as though they'd seen 100 miles of hiking. The dog, a huge black Leonberger, stood at attention, its gaze shifting from us to the man every few seconds. It was hard to tell whether the dog was nervous or just waiting for a command. Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. "Are you lost?" The man didn't look up right away. He kept playing, and the melody seemed to hang in the air, almost as if he didn't even hear me. I glanced at Jeremy, but he wasn't even looking at the guy anymore. He was staring back down the road toward the camp, clearly weighing whether we should just keep walking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The guy wasn't acting like a normal camper. Finally, the man stopped playing. He raised his head, and I saw his face for the first time. He looked older, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, and his face was unshaven with a layer of stubble. His eyes were tired, but there was an odd calmness to him, almost too calm, like he was lost, but he didn't care that he was lost. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I'm trying to get to the outhouse. Can you point me to it?" His question seemed so normal, so simple, that it threw me off even more. Here we were, 2 staff members out in the woods carrying garbage bags, and this guy, who we just happened to stumble across, was just asking for directions to the outhouse. It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing about this whole situation did. "Sure," I said, my voice a little too high, as I pointed back down the road. "It's down there, a few hundred yards. You'll see it to the right." The man nodded and turned without another word. The dog followed him without a sound, and he started walking back toward the camp, strumming his guitar again as if nothing had happened. The oddity of the whole thing hit me all at once. We had just encountered this guy in the middle of nowhere, and he wasn't freaked out at all. He was playing guitar, walking with a massive dog, acting like he knew exactly where he was going. It didn't make sense. "Come on," Jeremy whispered, already backing up, his eyes still glued to the man and his dog. "Let's go. Now." We turned and walked quickly back to the camp, not looking back. The sounds of the guitar faded as we made our way down the road, but the feeling in my chest didn't ease. My mind kept replaying the encounter over and over. What was that guy doing out here? How had he gotten past the camp and the rangers without anyone noticing? And why did he look so comfortable walking around in the middle of the night with that massive dog? When we got back to the camp, everything seemed normal, too normal. The kids were all asleep, and the other staff were sitting around the fire, chatting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I lay awake in my tent, the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside my window. My thoughts kept drifting back to the man, the guitar, the dog. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a guy out in the woods, but I couldn't stop wondering if there was more to it. What if he wasn't just a random camper? What if he was hiding something? But I never saw him again. The next day, everything seemed to return to normal. The camp went on as usual, and no one else reported anything strange. But I always wondered about that man and his guitar, out there in the woods in the middle of the night, with that huge dog by his side. It didn't sit right with me, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was harmless. We had been backpacking for days now, winding through the scorching heat of the Grand Canyon, down into the deep gorges and across the rocky terrain of the Horseshoe Mesa. The constant uphill and downhill, the heat from the sun during the day and the chills at night, had worn us all down. But tonight, there was something different in the air. We were getting closer to our final ascent, and we were all looking forward to finishing this leg of the journey. We were exhausted, sweaty, our clothes covered in dust, and all of us were getting pretty tired of the same old freeze-dried meals we'd been eating the whole trip. Mountain house meals, they were easy to make, but after a few days they started to lose their appeal. There was a hint of something salty in the air, like the hint of rain on the horizon, though we hadn't seen a cloud for days. As the sun dipped below the canyon walls, the sky darkened into an endless blanket of stars. We gathered our gear together, just the usual things: water bottles, snacks, maps, and a few trail bars. We could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional wind lifting up bits of dirt, but it wasn't enough to break the silence that had settled over us. We'd camped on this little mesa for the night. The ground was a mix of loose gravel, patches of sand, and dry, crunchy grass, ideal for spreading out our bivy sacks and settling down for the night. We didn't have tents, we didn't need them. The bivy sacks were enough to shield us from the elements, compact and lightweight, just perfect for backpacking. It was almost like sleeping under the stars, but with the protection of a thin shell around you. Each of us had rolled into our bags and wrapped up tight, feeling the weight of the day finally catch up to us. The stars were the kind of stars you could only see in places far removed from city lights, far removed from the distractions of daily life. They were thick and rich across the black canvas above us, but the air had a coldness to it now that we weren't moving. It was the kind of cold that made you appreciate the warmth of your sleeping bag, even though it wasn't enough to really make the night feel comfortable. I could hear the others around me shifting in their bags, the soft swish of fabric, the occasional rustle of a boot being adjusted. The fire had long been reduced to a few glowing embers, its warmth slowly fading as the night deepened. I closed my eyes, my body still sore from the constant exertion of the trail. The sound of crickets and the distant chirp of coyotes in the valley below were my only companions now, and the rhythm of my breathing began to sync with the night. I drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the wilderness becoming a lullaby in the background. Then it started. At first, it was the faintest sound, so quiet it could have been a trick of the wind. But then it became more distinct. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought it was just one of the others, maybe coming to use the restroom or shift around in their sleeping bag. But then I realized the steps were too deliberate, too calculated to be just someone fumbling around in the dark. The ground was a mixture of gravel, sand, and dry grass, so the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Every step was a little louder than the last, crunching softly, then fading as the person took another. I stayed perfectly still, listening closely. There was something about the sound that was off. It didn't sound like the typical clumsy shuffle of someone walking around a campsite in the middle of the night. It was measured, as if the person knew exactly where they were stepping. I could hear the soft scrape of fabric against the gravel, clothes rubbing together. Another sound that told me this person was wearing something more than just a light jacket. The other thing that caught my attention was the silhouette. The night was moonless, so the darkness was almost absolute. But the stars above had cast enough of a light to reveal the vague outline of a figure. It was hard to make out details, but I could see enough to know the figure wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It was moving through our camp, stepping carefully around the places where we had laid out our bags. The figure moved deliberately, a slow and careful pace that gave me an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't someone stumbling in the dark. It wasn't someone who had lost their way. It was as if this person knew exactly where they were going, or at least they didn't care about disturbing us. I lay there, completely still, my eyes barely open, staring at the dark shape as it drifted through the camp. I could hear the others breathing softly, but no one was talking. We were all awake, but none of us made a sound. It felt like time had slowed, like the moment was stretching out. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat growing louder in my ears. The figure continued to walk between our bags, and for a second, I thought they might come closer to me. I could feel my muscles tense, my body wanting to move, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to make a sound, to call out. I wasn't sure if I was frozen by fear or simply confused by the situation. What would I say? Who was this person? Why were they here? The figure didn't stop. It walked straight through the camp, moving between the sleeping bags like it was a routine. The whole time, I kept watching, trying to figure out if I was imagining it, but every movement was too real, too clear. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally passed through and disappeared into the night, becoming one with the darkness again. And then silence. No more footsteps, no more rustling. It was like they had never been there. I don't know how long I stayed in my bivy sack after that, but it felt like hours. My mind was racing. My heart was still thumping in my chest. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. What had just happened? Why hadn't anyone said anything? Why hadn't I said anything? Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, or maybe I just drifted off in a daze. The rest of the night was uneventful, but my mind was still on edge. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig in the distance made my heart race, and I stayed alert, half awake, waiting for another disturbance that never came. The next morning, we all woke up at the same time, everyone shifting and yawning as the sun's first light started to creep over the canyon. We began to pack up our bags, going through the usual motions of breaking camp. But as we did, we all started talking about the same thing, the footsteps. Every single one of us had heard it. Every single one of us had been awake, frozen in place, watching that figure walk through our camp. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some shared hallucination. We had all seen it, all heard it, and none of us had said a word until now. It was odd because, with all the permits issued for that area, we knew we weren't the only ones on the mesa. There were likely other backpackers camped out somewhere nearby, but no one had seen anyone else when we'd arrived. No one had passed us on the trail, no one had approached our camp. Yet, there was someone walking through our camp in the middle of the night. We didn't discuss it for too long. We had a long hike ahead of us, our final push to the top of the mesa. We didn't want to waste time speculating, especially when we still had so much ground to cover. We packed up our gear and set off, walking through the rocky terrain of the Grand Canyon, the sun beating down on us as the day began in earnest. But the strange thing is, even now, years later, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was that figure? Why had they walked through our camp? And why hadn't they said anything? I still don't know. There are so many permits issued in that area, and so many hikers passing through. But it's hard to ignore the feeling that someone had been watching us, walking among us, and then slipping away into the night without a trace. It's the kind of thing that leaves you with more questions than answers, and even now, I wonder if we'll ever really know the truth. We'd been planning this trip for months. A perfect weekend getaway in the woods. It was just me and 7 friends, 4 guys and 4 girls, all in our late teens or early 20s. We were all used to camping and we knew the area well. It was just outside a national park, a small patch of land that we usually like to visit. It wasn't much, just a spot with a good view of the loch, the kind of place where we could just relax, drink, and unwind without worrying about too much. But when we got there, things weren't quite as we expected. As we walked through the woods, talking and laughing, we reached the clearing where we usually set up camp. It was empty the last time we came, just us and the trees. This time, though, the scene was different. The spot was already taken. There were about 20 guys and 10 girls in their late teens, maybe early 20s, scattered around the area. At first glance, it was obvious that they were the kind of people you'd rather not have around. The way they were standing, the way they looked at us as we walked by, they were the type of crowd that made you feel uneasy. We didn't want to deal with them. They were loud, drinking, and carrying on. So we kept walking, heading further into the woods, past them. A few of them stared at us as we walked by, but we just ignored them and kept moving. We found a quieter spot a little farther in, away from them, where we knew we could set up without being bothered. After a short walk, we finally reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it would do. We quickly set up our tents, pulled out the camping gear, and began to make a fire. The evening was pretty normal at first. We joked around, talked, and cracked open some drinks. The usual camping vibe: good food, good company, and a bit of alcohol. We didn't think much about the other group, though we all noticed them a few times as they carried on back near the fence. We didn't say anything, figuring they'd leave us alone. They were on the other side of the woods, and we figured if they were going to be rowdy, they'd stay over there. But even though the night was young, something felt off. By 11 p.m., it was pitch dark. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that stretched across the trees. The wind had picked up a little, but it wasn't too bad. The air had that fresh, earthy smell, and the only sounds around us were the fire, the occasional chirp of a night bird, and the soft rustle of the trees. It was peaceful. Then I heard it. A faint sound at first, a giggle. I froze for a second, my heart skipping. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but there it was again. A high-pitched giggle coming from somewhere in the trees. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight. It was one of those expensive, ridiculously bright torches, one of those that could light up the whole world if you wanted it to. I flicked it on, scanning the area around us. The beam swept over the dark trees, cutting through the blackness. And there, crawling along the ground toward us, were 2 figures. They were low to the ground, barely visible except for their outline. At first, I thought they might have been animals, maybe deer, but then I realized they were too human-shaped. They were crawling like they were playing some kind of game, but they weren't kids, they looked like people, and that made my skin crawl. When the beam of the flashlight hit them, they froze for a second. Then they stood up, laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh. There was something off about it, something unsettling. They didn't seem to care that we had caught them. They just stood there for a moment, laughing, and then, without saying anything, they turned around and walked away, disappearing back into the trees. I turned to my friends, my heart racing a little. We exchanged uneasy glances, but nobody said anything. The laughter echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We all sat down again, trying to ignore it. It was probably just a prank or some kids messing around. But the unease lingered in the air like a cloud. 10 minutes later, the first bottle crashed into the ground, right in the middle of our circle. It was a glass bottle, heavy and sharp, and it shattered with a loud crack, the pieces skittering across the dirt. We all jumped to our feet, startled. I immediately looked around, shining the flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. It was just dark. Before anyone could speak, another bottle came flying through the air, landing just a few feet from where we were standing. Then another, this one barely missing the edge of my boot. The sound of glass breaking was deafening in the silence of the night. "That's it," one of the girls said, her voice shaking. "I'm calling the police." She pulled out her phone and dialed, but when she spoke to the operator, the response was anything but reassuring. "We're off-grid," the operator told her. "There's nothing we can do." Felt like a punch to the gut. We were in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no real help. If something went wrong, we were on our own. One of the guys suggested we should just leave, pack up, and go. But another spoke up, saying we'd be fine, that we should stand our ground and not let these people scare us off. We weren't sure what to do. Staying there, sitting around the fire, felt wrong now. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. But we didn't want to let them push us around. We decided to line up with our backs to the lock, making sure we had an open view of the trees. If they came for us, we would see them coming. Everyone grabbed something they could use as a weapon. I picked up a hatchet we had brought to chop firewood. Felt ridiculous, but it was better than nothing. The others grabbed whatever they could. Sticks, large rocks, anything they could swing or throw. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept scanning the darkness, shining the light into the trees, but all I saw was the faint outline of branches swaying in the wind. My heart was hammering in my chest. We stood there in silence, waiting, listening. Felt like an eternity before we heard anything. It was just a rustle at first, like something moving through the trees. Then we saw them. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, walking slowly but purposefully toward us. They were barely visible in the dark, but the light from my torch caught their faces. They looked like the same people we had seen earlier, the ones who had been crawling toward us. Now they were standing upright, but they weren't just walking. They were coming closer almost deliberately, as though they were testing us. I shined the torch directly at them, and they froze, caught in the beam of light. They didn't move. They just stood there, silent. It felt like they were waiting for us to do something, but no one moved. We all stayed in position, not knowing what would happen next. I gripped the hatchet tighter, my palms starting to sweat. The one in the front stepped forward slowly, his hands raised slightly, as if to show he wasn't holding anything. We stood there, facing each other in the silence of the night. The tension was unbearable, and for a few seconds, I wondered if we were going to have to fight. My mind raced, thinking about what they could be carrying, knives, bottles, anything. But instead of charging at us, they just stopped and stood there. The guy who had stepped forward gave us a look, and then, as quietly as they'd appeared, they turned around and walked back into the trees. We waited, hardly breathing, until the sound of their footsteps faded away completely. The silence returned, and the tension seemed to dissolve, but only a little. It wasn't over. We all stayed alert, still on edge, for the rest of the night, but they didn't come back. The rest of the night was quiet, unnervingly so. We didn't talk much, just kept the fire going and stayed close to the circle of light. There was a sense of relief, but also confusion. What had that been all about? Why had they come so close? Why had they backed off? In the morning, we packed up quietly, with no one saying much. We didn't need to. We all knew we'd been lucky. Could have gone a lot worse. We didn't see the group of people again. They were gone by the time we left, and the rest of the trip was uneventful. But the memory of that night, the sound of the bottles crashing, the eerie laughter, and the faces in the dark, stayed with me for a long time. We never went back to that spot. I was backpacking solo on the backside of the Tetons, a place I loved for its isolation. I'd been out there for days, away from the hustle of the more popular trails. There's something calming about being so far out, surrounded only by the mountains and the forest. That night, I camped next to a cliff that overlooked the valley below, the kind of spot where you feel like you're on top of the world. The full moon was hanging high, casting an eerie glow over everything. The rocks by the edge of the cliff seemed to shine in the moonlight, and I sat there for a while, just soaking it all in. The sky was crystal clear, and I could see the stars scattered across the heavens like tiny pinpricks of light. I had a sense of peace that night, the kind you only get when you're truly alone, just you and the wilderness. I got into my tent later, lying down and staring up at the roof, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the distant rustling of animals moving through the brush. It was one of those nights that felt still, but alive. I had no intention of falling asleep just yet. I wanted to take in the full experience of the Tetons at night. But somewhere in the silence, I drifted off. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up, but it was dead quiet, and something felt off. My senses started to kick in before my brain fully registered what was going on. The air felt heavy, and I could hear something moving. It wasn't the usual night sounds of wind or small animals. This was different, like the air was thick with anticipation. I turned my head slowly, listening harder. Then I heard it, a distant howl. It wasn't just one coyote, though. It was a whole pack. The howling came from all directions, as though they were closing in on my position. My heart started to race, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was the kind of sound you hear in movies when they're trying to make something seem ominous. But this was real. The howls echoed off the cliff, the sound surrounding me. I froze. At first, I thought maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I was just hearing things. But as the howling grew louder, I knew I was surrounded. The coyotes were out there right next to my tent, circling me. The sound of their calls echoed in the night, and I could almost feel them moving around, their eyes reflecting in the moonlight. I had read all the survival guides, knew the basics about not provoking animals, but right then, I was more concerned about the sheer number of them. I couldn't even tell how far away they were. It felt like they were just outside the thin fabric of my tent. Their eyes locked on me, their hunger obvious in their calls. My mind raced, considering all the options. I had a knife with me, a small utility tool, but that wasn't going to help against a pack. My gear was good, but no amount of gear would make a difference if they decided to get bold. I knew that coyotes usually didn't hunt alone, and they weren't typically dangerous to humans unless they were desperate, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I wasn't going to just sit there and wait to see what they would do. I thought about getting out of the tent, but that would put me in the open. No, I had to stay put for now, but I needed to make noise. I had read that making yourself seem bigger or making loud noises could scare them off. With my heart pounding, I sat up in my sleeping bag, reached for my flashlight, and turned it on. I didn't need the light so much as the noise, the click of it breaking the silence. I could hear the coyotes howling in response, and I clapped my hands together, loud, sharp, and deliberate. A burst of noise. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was my best shot. Then I clapped again, louder this time, trying to make myself sound as threatening as possible. I could hear the coyotes pause, and for a moment the silence felt heavy. I thought I might have gotten them to back off. Then, without warning, the howling started up again, but this time it wasn't as close. It was fading, moving further away. The sound of their calls grew more distant, and soon all I could hear was the wind once more. My heart was still racing, but the immediate danger had passed. I stayed there listening just in case they decided to come back, but the howling was gone. The pack had moved on. I couldn't say for sure how many there had been, but it had felt like dozens, circling me in the night. I let out a slow breath and settled back into my sleeping bag, trying to calm down, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept the flashlight near me and stayed alert, listening for any further signs of movement. When morning came, I packed up my camp quickly, the tension of the night still hanging over me. I didn't want to stick around any longer than necessary, even though the danger had passed. The sky was clear, the sun was rising, but I had no desire to linger in the area where I had been so close to something dangerous. I was glad I had scared the coyotes off, but I didn't want to test my luck further. I hiked out and moved on to a new spot, but the experience stuck with me. The howl of those coyotes echoed in my mind long after they were gone. A few weeks later, I was back in the Tetons again, this time working as part of the park service, doing some trail maintenance and working on service roads. I had gotten to know the area fairly well by then, and I spent a lot of my free time exploring places that weren't on the usual map, those little trails that didn't see much traffic. I liked the solitude. No tourists, no chatter, just the sounds of the mountains and the wildlife. I loved it. One afternoon, I was out on one of these lesser-known trails when I noticed something off the beaten path. It was a small game trail, barely visible but enough to catch my attention. I figured I'd follow it for a bit, see where it went. It wasn't long before I started noticing bones scattered across the ground. Small ones at first, like the remnants of small animals. I didn't think much of it at first. Nature had a way of reclaiming things, after all. I kept walking, the trail winding deeper into the forest. As I rounded a corner, I froze. There, scattered across the ground in front of me, were severed moose and deer limbs. Hooves, bones, pieces of flesh. It was like a massacre had taken place. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I looked around, taking in the scene. The bones weren't just left there. They had been torn apart, shredded. There was bare scat all over the place, and a nearby tree had been shredded to pieces. The bark had been torn off in long, jagged strips, and the tree itself was scarred deep by claws. The scent of the area was thick with something foul, like decay and musk. I had walked straight into a bear's feeding grounds, and judging by the signs, it was a grizzly. I looked around, trying to take in everything, but it was hard to focus. The trail had led me to what I knew was a dangerous spot. I wasn't sure if the bear was nearby or if it had just left, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. My heart was pounding, and my instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I turned around slowly, careful not to make any loud movements, and began to backtrack, retracing my steps until I reached the main trail again. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I didn't dare turn around. I made it back to the main road, and I kept walking, not stopping until I reached the nearest ranger station. I was shaken. I had worked in the Tetons long enough to know the risks, but I'd never expected to stumble upon something like that. The area I had wandered into wasn't marked as a bear habitat, and I had no idea how close I had come to a potentially dangerous situation. The whole experience, from the coyotes that night to the bears' feeding grounds, had made me realize just how unpredictable the wilderness could be. It wasn't the sort of thing you could plan for, no matter how much you thought you knew the land. That night, back at camp, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The claws on that tree, the torn limbs of the animals. I didn't feel fear so much as a deep respect for the power of nature. I was just another part of it, and I had to respect the fact that I was not at the top of the food chain. It was something I'd always known, but never had it felt so real. I made sure to stick to the main trails after that, avoiding those quiet corners of the woods that might hold danger I couldn't see. It was a lesson I wouldn't forget, that sometimes the wild places weren't as safe as they seemed, and I had to keep my eyes open. It's something I carry with me now wherever I hike. The Tetons are beautiful, but they remind you that beauty doesn't come without danger, and sometimes danger is just around the corner, hidden in plain sight. It was the kind of day that felt like winter had completely claimed the world. The snow had been coming down all day, falling in thick flakes that drifted lazily to the ground and blanketed everything in white. The kind of snow that makes the world quiet, like the world itself is muffling its own sounds. I had always loved days like this, where everything was softened by the snow. No cars honking, no chatter in the air, just the crunch of boots in the snow. It was peaceful in a way. My mom had decided to take us sledding, and it felt like the perfect day to do it. My brothers were eager, running ahead with their sleds, practically dragging us along as we made our way through the thick snow, heading out to a place just a little beyond where we usually went. It was a patch of land we always crossed on our way to the bigger hills, but this time we would stop. We'd never really taken a long look at it, but today felt different, like it would be the right place for the kind of sledding that really makes you feel alive. The area was a couple of big fields connected by a long slope. Nothing spectacular at first glance, but for sledding, it was perfect. The snow had just enough ice to it that you could go pretty fast if you caught the right part of the slope. My mom, brothers, and I trudged across the fields, and even though the wind was biting, I felt that familiar sense of excitement that you get when you're about to have fun in the snow. The air was cold, crisp, and the sky was this dark, cloudy gray, with snow falling in heavy sheets. It was winter at its fullest. As we climbed up the hill to the highest part of the field, I looked around at the emptiness of it all. There was no one else out here. The land was state-owned, and most people didn't venture far from the main roads or the places they were familiar with. You'd have to know the area well to find the spots like this one, tucked away and hidden by the thick woods that surrounded it. As we reached the top of the hill, something made me pause. It was the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, the kind of silence that feels almost too still, like the air is holding its breath. I glanced around, and that's when I saw it. A figure moving toward us from the far edge of the field. At first, I thought it might have been someone else who had the same idea as us. But there was something about it that didn't feel right. This figure didn't belong. I could tell right away that it was a man, but he didn't move like someone who was just out for a walk or a casual outing. His movements were stiff, purposeful, and his clothes seemed to blend too easily with the surroundings, as if he were trying to be invisible. The snow swirling around him didn't seem to settle on him, as though it slid off and disappeared into the cold air. My first thought was that he didn't seem human, like something about him wasn't quite right. As we got closer, the figure became clearer. The man was older, probably in his 60s, but his face was covered by a scruffy beard that matched the graying hair that hung from his head like a tangle of frozen twigs. His clothes were all gray pants, gray jacket, a thick, worn-out wool sweater underneath. The strangest thing, though, was his eyes. They were a dull, pale blue, almost like they were faded from too many years of being exposed to the elements. They didn't look friendly. They looked cold, detached. His whole presence was unsettling. He had a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. The rifle didn't look new, not even close. It was weathered and worn, the metal tarnished and scratched. The sight of it sent a strange chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I couldn't place exactly why, but the sight of that rifle felt wrong. It didn't fit the peaceful setting we were in, surrounded by nothing but snow and open fields. He wasn't supposed to be there, not in the middle of nowhere on a snowy day like this. My mom, of course, was the first to try and break the tension. She was always the one who tried to keep things normal, even when something felt off. As he got closer, she smiled, raised a hand, and said something like, "Good afternoon." She wasn't worried, not at first. She probably thought he was just another person out for a winter walk, maybe even someone who was hunting in the area, though that seemed odd given that the snow had been falling all day and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. He stopped walking as we got closer, standing just a few feet away from us. His eyes locked onto my mom, but he didn't smile, didn't even nod. He just looked at us, blankly. There was something about that gaze that made it feel like we weren't seen, like he wasn't even really looking at us, but through us. And then, without missing a beat, he muttered something I didn't quite catch at first. "I'm hunting wolf," he said, his voice as cold and empty as his stare. And just like that, he turned away from us and continued walking across the field. My mom seemed a little thrown off by the interaction but didn't say anything more. We just stood there for a moment, watching him as he walked off into the snow, fading into the white. I don't remember if we saw where he went. I don't know if he kept walking off into the woods or disappeared into the snow. But something in me felt like we were no longer alone in the world. Something about that man, his presence, had changed the air around us. We didn't talk much after that. My brothers, as always, were more interested in the sledding, and we carried on like nothing had happened. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about what the man had said. Hunting wolf. It didn't make sense. For one, there were no wolves in the area. They hadn't been in these woods for decades, not since the early 1900s. Wolves had been wiped out in this region a long time ago, and they certainly weren't going to come back during a snowstorm in the middle of winter. Then there was the fact that hunting season didn't even begin until the fall, and there was no reason for anyone to be hunting in this field. The land we were on was public, state-owned, and to hunt there, you needed a permit. No one was hunting out here, not in the snow, not in these conditions. It didn't add up. It just didn't. And there was something off about the man's presence, something that didn't belong. I had spent my entire life in these woods, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. If anyone was hunting out here, they'd need to be prepared for the weather, for the snow, for the visibility. This man wasn't prepared, not at all, and his story didn't add up. We spent the rest of the day sledding, but it was different after that. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. My mom, thankfully, didn't seem as concerned, but my brothers were oblivious, lost in the thrill of sledding down the hill. It wasn't until we were packing up to leave that I realized how much time had passed. The sky had darkened, and the snow was still falling thickly around us. I never saw that man again, and I never really wanted to. I never learned who he was, what he was doing out there in the middle of nowhere, or why he'd claimed to be hunting wolves. But I knew one thing for sure. That encounter had left me with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Something about it felt wrong, like the man was hiding something, like he was doing something he shouldn't have been. And no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I couldn't get rid of that feeling. I don't know if he was just some random person, or if he had something else in mind when he crossed our path. But I'll always remember the way he looked, the way he spoke, and the way he just kept walking, like we weren't even there. Maybe he was just a stranger lost in the snow, or maybe he wasn't. But I've always believed that there's something about being out in the woods, especially in winter, when the world feels empty and closed off, that makes people act differently. It's like the snow itself holds secrets, things you're not meant to see, and if you wander too far, you might end up uncovering them. I never really went back to that field again. Maybe it's because I always wondered if I'd run into him again, or maybe it's because I just couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been out there with us that day. Something watching. And if I'm being honest, I think I've always known that some things are better left unknown. Aziscaho's Lake in Maine had always sounded like the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. We had talked about it for months. My friends and I wanted an adventure, something to break the usual routine. The idea of roughing it, truly roughing it, with no fancy campsite amenities or prepared meals seemed like the ultimate bonding experience. We were all in our early 20s, eager to embrace the outdoors, but honestly, none of us really knew what we were getting into. What was supposed to be a fun, carefree weekend of camping turned into something entirely different. There were 8 of us in total, split into 3 groups: red team, blue team, and green team. Red and blue teams were supposed to head out to the lake early in the day, and green team would join us later in the evening. We rented 2 kayaks and a canoe for the trip, thinking it would be easy enough to ferry everything over. Looking back, it's almost comical how unprepared we were. None of us had really ever done anything like this before, and packing everything we thought we might need was a disaster. We had too much stuff, and we quickly realized that not everything was going to fit into the boats. Blue team was made up of 2 people, while red and green teams each had 3. We paddled out to our site with no real issues, though it was hard work hauling all the gear. It took longer than expected, but eventually, we found ourselves standing at the campsite, surrounded by dense forest. It was nestled at the bottom of a large hill, and the ground was soft and muddy. Water from the hill ran through our site, pooling in the low areas. Finding a spot to pitch the tents was a challenge, to say the least. The rain was already starting to sprinkle, but nothing serious yet. We decided that blue team would head back to the cars to grab the rest of our stuff while red team stayed behind and tried to set up camp. We were all pretty laid back at first, laughing about how unprepared we were. It felt like an adventure, and none of us had any real concerns. However, that mood quickly shifted as the weather began to turn. By the time blue team got back to the cars, the rain had started, just a light drizzle at first. They packed up the remaining gear and began the long paddle back to camp. Things took a drastic turn as the weather picked up. The rain began coming down harder, and the wind started picking up. Blue team decided to put all three of them in the canoe and tow the two kayaks behind it. It was supposed to be a quick paddle, but it didn't take long before the boats started taking on water. They paddled along the shore for a while, hoping it would ease up, but the rain just kept coming down in sheets. Eventually, they decided they needed to find shelter, and the only option was a cabin they had seen earlier. When they beached the boats, they sprinted for the cabin. Unfortunately, no one was there. The door was locked, but there was a small porch area that offered some shelter. They huddled there for a while, hoping the storm would pass, but the wind was so strong that it blew the rain right into the shelter. They briefly considered breaking into the cabin, recalling that Maine law allows for emergency entry in certain circumstances, but ultimately decided against it. Thankfully, the storm began to subside. The rain turned from torrential to light showers, and they quickly bailed the water out of the boats before setting off once again. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, red team was already having problems. The rain had started earlier than expected, and the ground quickly became a mess. The high, dry ground we had thought we found had become non-existent. Water began running through the site, flooding the area around the tents. It didn't take long before we realized the tents weren't exactly waterproof. The seams leaked, and water began pooling inside. One of us, who was already pretty high, became extremely paranoid, clutching a flashlight and muttering about bears in the woods. The other, while still sober, was understandably anxious, worried about branches falling on the tents. They did what they could, digging a rudimentary moat around the tent to try to direct some of the water away, but it wasn't enough. Back on the water, blue team had pressed on, despite the growing darkness and worsening storm. As they approached a large alcove in the lake, the rain began pouring down again. It was too late to stop and wait for the storm to pass, so they pushed forward. But just as they neared the entrance to the cove, the first flash of lightning lit up the sky, and in that moment, they realized just how bad things had gotten. Being in a metal canoe during a lightning storm was a horrible idea. Panic set in, and they made the decision to beach the boats immediately. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind was bitterly cold, and everyone was wearing bathing suits and cotton t-shirts with no shoes. They began bushwhacking through the dense woods, trying to find shelter. It was pitch black by now, and the only light they had came from the occasional lightning strike. The wind howled, and the sound of rain pelting the ground filled the air. They held onto each other's shirts as they stumbled through the trees, trying not to lose each other. They could barely see, and every time the lightning flashed, they would freeze for a moment, trying to assess their surroundings. After what felt like an eternity, they finally spotted a cabin in the distance and ran toward it. Unfortunately, when they got there, the door was locked, and there was no porch or overhang for cover. They kept walking, moving through the rain-soaked woods until they saw another cabin, this one with lights on inside. Relief washed over them, and they hastily approached the porch. They knocked on the door, desperate for help, and when it opened, they were greeted by two figures sitting on the porch. They explained their situation as best they could. The two men on the porch jumped up in concern. "Are you guys all right?" one of them asked, and they quickly ushered the soaked and shivering trio inside. The cabin was full of people. A family had gathered there for a small party, and everyone was drunk. But despite the alcohol, they were all incredibly kind, offering food, dry clothes, and a place to stay for the night. Blue team gratefully accepted the dry clothes and food, but explained that red team was still stranded at camp, and green team hadn't arrived yet. The patriarch of the family, a burly man with a thick Maine accent, explained that there was an access road that led directly from the cabin to the lake put in, where green team was probably waiting. He offered to drive them to the put-in and then take them back to their campsite on his pontoon boat. And without much hesitation, Blue Team accepted his help. The man gave them a flashlight, and they set off to retrieve their boats from the beach. The rain had stopped, and the wind had died down, though the storm had left behind a still, eerie silence. They moved quickly, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. When they reached the boats, they found that they had miraculously stayed in place. The boats were still partially filled with water, but they managed to bail most of it out before setting off again. As they paddled toward the dock, the air felt eerily still. The surface of the water was as smooth as glass, and the silence was unnerving. The only sound was the quiet splash of the paddles as they worked their way forward. When they reached the dock, they loaded the boats onto the pontoon boat and piled into the truck for the ride down the access road. As they approached the put-in, they saw Green Team's car parked there, and Blue Team ran up to knock on their window. They'd been sitting in the car, waiting out the rain, and when the window rolled down, the unmistakable smell of weed wafted out. Blue Team couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. They had been struggling all night, and Green Team had been sitting comfortably in the car, hotboxing it. Still, they were just happy to see them. Blue Team told Green Team about the plan to get to the campsite and that they should follow the truck back. Once they piled back into the truck, the patriarch drove off quickly, not bothering to slow down to let Green Team catch up. Blue Team tried to communicate with them, but the truck was speeding ahead, and Green Team was falling behind. "Don't worry," the man said. "There's only one way to go. They can't get lost." Blue Team was a little concerned but didn't voice it. When they finally reached the cabin, Green Team was just pulling in behind them. Everyone quickly hopped into the pontoon boat, and the man's son stood at the bow, shouting out directions as they began the final leg of the journey. The weather had turned again, this time for the worse. Rain and wind returned, and the boat was tossed about in the choppy waters. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the only thing guiding them was the occasional flash of lightning. The man and his son, both heavily intoxicated, seemed to have little regard for the obstacles in their path. The boat careened dangerously close to rocks and logs, and Blue Team held their breath, hoping they wouldn't hit anything. After what seemed like an eternity of bouncing around, the man finally admitted defeat. "We're not going to make it tonight," he said, his slurred words barely audible over the storm. "We'll head back to the cabin." The rain pelted them mercilessly as they turned the boat around and headed back to the shore. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they could do. The next morning, the weather had cleared, and the storm was nothing but a memory. The skies were blue, the air crisp. Blue and Green Teams made their way back to the campsite, where Red Team was waiting. They were miserable, haggard, and covered in mud, but they were alive. As Blue and It was 8 years ago, a crisp fall weekend that had always been our family's retreat. We'd done this every year, a group getaway for families from my husband's company. This time was special, though. Things were going well for the company, and we were flush with a bit of extra money. For the first time, we decided to skip the communal bunkhouses and rent a camper instead. It seemed like a good idea at the time. We'd get the full experience of the outdoors, but with the comfort of air conditioning and privacy. The RV rental company even had a deal for us. They said it would cost the same for 2 nights as it would for 3, so we decided to keep the camper until Monday, even though the retreat itself was ending on Sunday. The weekend itself went by without incident. We spent time hiking, joining in group activities, and socializing. It was unseasonably hot for October, but we were grateful for the AC inside the camper. The kids, 3 girls all under the age of 10, were happy. They'd run around with the other children at the retreat, play games, and generally wear themselves out. My husband and I got some quiet moments here and there to relax, even though there were constant comings and goings of people. Everything seemed fine, but by Sunday evening, things started to go wrong. Around 6 o'clock, we noticed a strange smell inside the camper. At first, it was faint, and I figured it was just some dust or something, but by the time the clock hit 8:30, it was unmistakable. The smell of sewage filled the air. My husband inspected the bathroom and realized the toilet was starting to back up. Not only that, but the whole camper smelled like something had been festering for a long time. It turned out the previous renters hadn't bothered to clear out the septic lines, and it was now our problem. My husband wasn't thrilled about it. We were already in a bit of a bind, not wanting to deal with the rental company accusing us of causing the problem, so he decided to drive to the nearby Walmart in the neighboring town. The drive was going to be long, over an hour round trip at least. He promised it wouldn't take long, just a quick run for some drain cleaner, and I'd be fine handling things with the kids for the time being. I wasn't thrilled about him leaving, but what else could we do? It was about 8:30 when he left, and I immediately started packing up our things. The kids were already getting antsy, asking questions about what we were doing, and I tried to distract them with simple tasks. I figured we had time to clean up before the long drive home the next day. The RV was small, and with all the kids running in and out, I could feel the tension in the air. It was one of those moments where you realize you've become hyper-aware of everything going on around you, even though it should have just been a normal evening. By 9:15, I was starting to feel uneasy. The girls were all tucked into bed, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the smell or the fact that we were so isolated in this large campground with hardly anyone else around. I tried to push the thoughts away. The place was practically empty, and I had heard that it wasn't unusual for there to be long stretches of time where you didn't see many people. The retreat space was mostly used by the church, and except for a few events during the year, the place was often quiet. I tried to settle down. I climbed into the loft bed above the truck can and grabbed a book, hoping it would distract me. The soft hum of the AC in the background was calming, and I figured that once the kids were asleep and my husband returned, I could finally relax. But as the minutes ticked on, I noticed something. There was a faint clicking sound coming from the window behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or trees brushing against the glass, a normal outdoor sound. But then it happened again, click, click, click. My heart rate picked up slightly, and I tensed. It wasn't like the usual sounds of nature, the breeze rustling the leaves or the occasional animal. This was different. I lay still in the bed, trying to listen more closely, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then I heard the scraping, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across glass. It wasn't wind or nature. It was deliberate. I felt a cold rush of panic hit my chest. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. Maybe an animal was just climbing along the side of the camper, or maybe it was the wind. But my gut told me it was something else. Something was wrong. The scraping continued. I pushed myself up from the bed, careful not to make any noise. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I carefully made my way down the ladder to the kitchen. The noise didn't stop. It followed me, growing more distinct with every step. My hand shook as I grabbed the knife from the kitchen drawer, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but something about the sound made me feel like I had to be prepared. As I moved into the loft, I kept my eyes trained on the windows, the door. Everything had to be locked. My mind was racing, thinking through the possible escape routes if something went wrong. I tried to get a signal on my phone, but there was no service. Nothing. The security at the campground was a joke, and I was completely alone. The kids were asleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there knew I was here. It felt too intentional, too calculated. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound to stop, waiting for something, anything, to give me an answer. I glanced out the window and saw nothing, just the dim moonlight and shadows. No one was walking around, no sign of movement except the trees. But then, just as I thought I was losing my mind, I heard it again. The handle on the door rattled. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was outside trying to get in. I pressed myself back into the corner of the loft, clutching the knife. Couldn't believe it. I thought of the kids, all tucked in and oblivious. I thought of my husband, who was hours away from being home. What if I couldn't protect them? My thoughts spiraled as I huddled there, listening, praying for the noise to stop. I couldn't see anything. The door handle rattled again, louder this time, followed by more scraping on the window. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. The minutes stretched on. I could feel my heart racing, each thump in my chest loud and unsettling. I glanced down at my phone. Still no signal. The fear of being isolated hit me full force. I had no way to reach anyone for help. There was nothing I could do except wait for my husband to return. It felt like hours had passed before I saw the headlights in the distance, winding their way down the dark, narrow road toward the campground. When my husband finally walked in, he looked at me like I had lost my mind. He scoffed at me, rolling his eyes, dismissing my fears. "What? You think someone's going to break out of prison and attack us out here in the middle of nowhere?" He laughed. I tried to explain what had happened, the rattling door, the scraping noises, but he wasn't having it. He told me it was just the wind or some animals. He was annoyed that I had worked myself up over nothing. That night, I hardly slept, tossing and turning, my mind running through the possibilities. What if someone really had been out there? What if they had been trying to get in? But everything seemed fine the next morning. My husband and I packed up the camper and drove into the town to return it. It wasn't until the rental manager came around to inspect the RV that we learned just how close we had come to a much worse situation. The manager, a thin, stern man, walked up to my husband and started pointing out the damage. "Do you know what happened to the rear window?" he asked. My husband looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Apparently, someone had used a knife or some other sharp object to slice through the window gasket, where I had been sitting just the night before. There were clear gashes in the paint, consistent with knife marks. The window lock was damaged as well. The manager said it looked like someone had also tried to pry open the door, using the same knife to jam it into the lock. They hadn't gotten in, but it was clear someone had been trying. I felt my stomach drop. I had been right. Someone had been out there trying to break in. My husband and I exchanged a look, both of us shaken by what we had discovered. But the manager assured us that we wouldn't be charged for the damage, as it was obvious it hadn't been our fault. But the feeling of relief didn't come. It was replaced by a deep sense of unease that never quite went away. We left the campground that day, and we haven't been back since. I haven't gone on a solo camping trip since then either. Safety in numbers, as they say. The whole experience left me shaken, knowing that we had been so close to something much worse. I can still feel the cold weight of that fear, the uncertainty that came with not knowing who was out there. And even though I didn't see the face of whoever was trying to break in, I still wonder if they were watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment. It's a fear that stays with me, a reminder of how fragile our safety can be in situations we think are harmless. And I still can't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I worked at a sleepaway summer camp several years ago. It was deep in the woods, tucked away in a place where the nearest town was an hour's drive. And even then, it was small enough to be easy to miss. There were about 30 of us on staff that summer, mostly young adults just trying to enjoy the outdoors while also keeping an eye on a bunch of energetic kids. The camp was designed for kids who wanted to experience nature. Hiking, canoeing, campfires, all of it. But sometimes, things in the woods can be a little more than you expect. It was a late-night staff meeting. I can still remember the warmth of the room, the smell of coffee that had been brewed too late in the day, and the tired faces of the counselors around the table. We were winding down after a long day. The kids were in their cabins, asleep for the night. The only thing that kept us awake was the long list of tasks we had to get through before we could finally crawl into bed ourselves. But then, from outside, we heard something. First, it was soft, a distant noise barely there. It wasn't clear at first what it was, just a weird, unsettling sound, like something trying to scream but not quite getting it right. A sort of high-pitched cry, almost like the whimper of a baby. It was faint but distinct, cutting through the quiet night air. Everyone froze. We all turned toward the door like a collective instinct. The sound came again, louder this time, and there was no mistaking it. It was the cry of a baby, but wrong. Something about it felt off, like it didn't belong in the woods. It didn't make any sense. There were no houses nearby, no families camping out here. The only people at the camp were the staff and the kids, of course. The closest town, as I said, was an hour away. A baby? This deep in the woods? For a few seconds, no one spoke. I think we were all just trying to make sense of it in our heads. Then, one of the other counselors, Jack, stood up, his face set with determination. "I'll go check it out," he said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. His tone was practical, like it was just another night in the woods, but I could see the unease on his face. He turned to the rest of us. "Who's with me?" I didn't want to go. Honestly, I didn't. Something about that cry, that pitiful wail, didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't back down. Everyone else in the room was looking at Jack, and somehow I felt like if I didn't join him, I'd never be able to explain myself later. So I stood up. Then Sarah, another counselor, volunteered. The three of us headed out into the woods, armed with nothing but flashlights and the determination to figure out what the hell was going on. The night was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, leaves, and pine. The woods were quiet aside from the strange cries echoing through the trees. We kept walking, our boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the light from our flashlights flickering in the distance. The sound seemed to come from further in, just beyond the tree line. As we moved deeper into the woods, the air got heavier. The sound of the cry faded in and out, almost like it was circling us. It was unnerving. Every step felt like we were getting closer to something we shouldn't be. My heart was thudding in my chest, but I told myself to keep going. After all, it was just a baby, right? Maybe some lost camper? Or some animal making a noise that sounded like a baby. It had to be that, I reasoned. Then we saw it. It wasn't a baby at all. We reached the edge of a small, slow-moving stream that cut through the woods, its dark water reflecting the moonlight. And there, lying on the bank, was a rabbit. It was barely moving, blood slowly flowing from its body into the stream. I felt my stomach lurch at the sight of it. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, its body twisted in a way that made it clear it had been through something horrible. It wasn't just injured, it was dying. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the poor thing. The rabbit's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed, and the blood flowed down into the stream, turning the water a dull red. It was a pitiful sight, one that made my skin crawl. It was clear that something had ripped this animal apart. The sight was enough to make me feel sick to my stomach. Jack was the first to speak, his voice low and shaky. "A fox probably did this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I'll put it out of its misery." Sarah and I exchanged a look. We both knew something wasn't right, but neither of us said anything. We were all too rattled by the sight of the rabbit, too distracted by the gruesome image to think straight. Jack knelt down by the animal, his hands shaking as he prepared to end its suffering. But just as he moved to touch the rabbit, a noise broke the silence. The sound of something moving in the woods. It was a heavy, deliberate sound. Not the rustling of a smaller animal, but something much larger. Something that didn't belong in a place like this. We all froze. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no mistaking it. Whatever it was moving towards us. The air around us seemed to grow even colder. We turned, our flashlights dancing nervously across the dark forest. For a moment, there was nothing. Then we heard it again, this time much closer. A deep growl, followed by the distinct snap of a branch under heavy paws. Then we saw it, the shadow of something large, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It was too big to be a fox, a large shape creeping just at the edge of the trees. Jack's face turned white. He stood up quickly, backing away from the stream. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't need any more convincing. Sarah and I turned and started running. Jack followed close behind us. We didn't dare look back, not even for a second. We just kept running, the sound of our pounding feet filling the night air. We didn't stop until we were back within sight of the staff house, where the warm light from the windows seemed like the only safe place left in the world. But then something happened that I'll never forget. As we reached the edge of the clearing, Jack came running past us. His clothes were drenched in blood, bright red, soaked into his shirt and pants. His eyes were wide, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. What happened? I managed to ask, though the question barely made sense in my own head. My heart was still racing. Jack didn't answer immediately. He just kept running, his footsteps loud and frantic, until we reached the staff house. We burst through the door, and the meeting inside went silent. We were all breathing heavily, still in shock from what we'd just seen. Jack staggered to the center of the room, covered in blood, and collapsed onto one of the chairs. That's when he told us what had happened. That growl we'd heard? It wasn't just any animal. It was a cougar, a big one, and it had been after the rabbit. The reason Jack had come back covered in blood was that, in a last-ditch effort to escape, he had thrown the now-dead rabbit at the cougar, hoping to distract it long enough to get away. The cougar had lunged at the rabbit, but Jack had managed to slip past it, running back to us. We all stood there, stunned, processing what he was saying. A cougar? That was the thing that had been stalking us in the woods? The very same one that had been crying like a baby to lure us in? The camp director immediately went into emergency mode. Within minutes, the camp was under wildlife lockdown. The entire staff was on alert, and rangers were called in to help track and trap the cougar. The next few hours felt surreal as we all sat in the staff house, too shaken to sleep, waiting for updates. Eventually, the rangers found tracks and evidence that confirmed our worst fears. The cougar had been in the area for a while, hunting and stalking the woods near the camp. They set up traps and used calls to try to lure it out, but thankfully, by morning, the animal had been caught. It was a massive cougar, probably the biggest anyone had seen in years. That night, we all learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the sounds of the wild can deceive you. The cry of a baby wasn't a baby at all. It was the sound of a dying rabbit, being hunted by something far more dangerous than we ever could have imagined. We never went back into the woods that night. We stayed inside, glued to the windows, waiting for the rangers to finish their work. And that was the end of it. The cougar was taken away, and the camp eventually resumed normal operations. But that night, it was something I'll never forget. The lesson was clear. If you ever hear a cry in the woods, something that sounds like a baby, don't go after it. The woods don't care about you. You're not supposed to be there. I've always loved camping, ever since I was a kid. Growing up in the mountains, it was just a part of life. My family spent most weekends in the woods, whether it was hiking, fishing, or just setting up camp under the stars. But somewhere along the way, life took me away from those mountains. Work, relationships, city life, it all got in the way. It had been more than 10 years since I'd last spent a night in the wilderness, and I'd been craving it. So, when I finally got the chance to take a solo trip back to the mountains, I didn't hesitate. The drive was long, too long, honestly. I didn't leave until late afternoon, and by the time I reached the area I wanted to camp, twilight was already beginning to settle in. I had planned to find a spot and set up camp by nightfall, but that didn't happen. The sun dipped behind the ridges, and the trees were already starting to cast long shadows when I pulled off the main road onto a narrow, winding back road in the national forest. I had planned to camp somewhere more established, but I figured I'd just find a quiet spot off the beaten path for the night. I found a place near a small creek. It seemed perfect, quiet, tucked away, and far from any roads. I figured it'd be a good spot to sleep in the truck. I wasn't ready to set up a tent, not with the light fading fast. So, I stuffed my sleeping bag and air mattress into the back of the truck's cab, made sure everything was secure, and settled in for the night. But then, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. The woods were dead quiet. Not a single bird call, not a rustle of leaves from a squirrel or a rabbit. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you feel like something is wrong. I've camped enough to know that the woods don't get that quiet unless something's up. Even at night, you usually hear something, a night owl, a breeze, something. But here, Nothing. First, I brushed it off. Could have just been the time of day. The light fading, animals starting to settle down. I kept working, pulling out the last of my gear. That's when I heard it. A loud, shrill alarm call from a Stellar's jay. The bird was clearly agitated. It was a warning, but for what? Corvids like jays, crows, and ravens are known for their ability to sense danger. They'll alert the other animals when they spot something threatening. I stood still, listening, trying to figure out what had spooked the bird. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a blur, too fast to make out clearly. But I saw enough to know it wasn't a deer or any of the usual forest animals I'd expect to see. There, between two trees on the far side of the creek, I saw a shape moving. It was tawny, blending into the shadows of the forest. I didn't see the head or the tail, just the top of its hindquarters as it passed behind some brush. For a second, I thought maybe it was a deer. That's what my brain wanted to believe. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. Deer make noise when they move, especially in the forest with all the leaves and pine needles on the ground. They step on things, they break branches, they make the woods sound alive. This thing made no sound. Nothing. It was as quiet as a shadow. A sinking feeling hit my stomach. It was a predator. It had to be. I knew the signs, even if I didn't want to admit it. The way it moved, the silence, the fact that it was large and tawny. It had to be a mountain lion. The thought hit me like a punch in the chest. I'd heard stories of mountain lions in the area, but I'd never thought I'd come face to face with one. My eyes scanned the woods. The way the animal had been moving, it seemed like it was headed in my direction. And I was near a creek. If it was going to cross, I'd see it. I hurried to finish setting up the back of the truck, my mind racing. I needed to get inside the cab where I'd be safe. But the feeling of being watched, being hunted, was growing stronger by the second. It wasn't just the quiet or the bird's warning call anymore. It was the oppressive sense that something was out there, waiting, observing. I pulled the last of my gear into the truck and slammed the tailgate shut. The sound echoed in the otherwise still air, sharp and loud. And then, almost immediately, I heard it. 3 deep, powerful bounds. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't running away, but it was moving fast, away from the truck, heading toward the creek. But then it stopped. I couldn't hear it anymore. The silence was even thicker now. My heart was pounding in my chest. It was like the forest itself had held its breath. I didn't wait. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I stared out the windshield into the darkness. The headlights cut a narrow path of light, but the woods beyond were just black shadows. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew there was something out there. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound, every rustle of branches or shift of leaves made me jump. My eyes stayed wide open, scanning the trees, the dark corners of the clearing, expecting to see that tawny shape again. But it never appeared. I kept the lights on for most of the night, hoping it would help keep whatever was out there away. But I knew it was just a comfort, not a real defense. A mountain lion doesn't care about headlights. It's not going to be scared off by the sound of a car. If anything, it might just be more curious. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching out like hours. Every now and then, I would hear a distant crack of a branch, but nothing close enough to make me think it was the cat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Maybe it was just the adrenaline, or maybe it was something primal, an instinct that told me to stay alert. By the time morning light started to filter through the trees, I was exhausted but still on edge. I hadn't heard anything in the last few hours, and that was a little comforting. I had been convinced that the cat would return in the dark, but as the sun began to rise, the woods slowly came back to life. Birds started to call again. The soft murmur of the creek resumed its gentle flow, and the world felt normal again. I wasn't about to stick around to see if the mountain lion came back, though. I'd had enough for one night. I started the truck and slowly backed it out of the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting the cat to emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. I drove out of there without looking back. As I headed down the road, I couldn't help but feel a rush of mixed emotions. I was shaken, yes, but there was also a part of me that was exhilarated. I just had a real encounter with one of the wildest predators in North America, and I'd made it through the night, which meant something, even if I hadn't exactly been brave about it. For the rest of my trip, I camped in more populated areas, where the chances of seeing anything like that again were slim. But that one night, when the woods went silent and I realized I wasn't alone, stayed with me. It was terrifying, but it was also a reminder of why I love the wilderness. There's something raw and powerful about it, something that makes you feel alive, even if that life is a little too close to the edge. I still camp alone most of the time, and while I'm more cautious now, I can't say I'm afraid. The wilderness is unpredictable, and danger is always lurking, but that's part of the thrill. That's why I keep coming back. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being in the woods, where you're truly on your own, but at the same time, connected to something bigger. Even if, sometimes, that something is a mountain lion watching you from the trees. The night we arrived at the campsite, it was already past midnight. We had been driving for hours, the road twisting and turning as we made our way into the wilderness. Our group of 4 friends had been planning this camping trip for weeks, looking forward to the weekend of hiking, fishing, and just getting away from everything. But we didn't arrive on time to do much else other than set up our tents and huddle around the fire for a short while before crashing. The campsite was just outside of a small town that was famous for its day-long rafting trips on a river that ran through the area. We didn't have much time to explore it, though, as the sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I remember stumbling through the woods with my friends, trying to set up our tent, our flashlights flickering and casting weak beams through the trees. The sound that night was odd, something I couldn't place. It wasn't quite the rustling of a typical breeze, but more like something larger moving through the forest. The leaves shifted violently as if something unseen was pushing through them. At first, I thought it was just the wind, nothing unusual. But it didn't stop. The rustling grew louder, and I remember feeling a bit unsettled, as if whatever was causing the sound was all around us, too close for comfort. But we were kids, and our excitement overpowered any uneasy feelings we might have had. We pushed it aside and focused on setting up camp. The other guys didn't seem too concerned about the noise, so I shrugged it off too. We set up our tent and then gathered around the fire. The only light we had was from our lantern and the faint glow of our flashlights. As we sat there, talking about nothing and everything at once, I kept hearing that rustling sound, still more intense than the usual nighttime breeze. It was like something brushing against the trees, constantly moving. Eventually, we went to sleep, or at least I tried to. The noise outside continued, but it was almost like a background hum now, something I didn't want to acknowledge because, if I thought about it too much, I knew I'd end up too freaked out to sleep. So I just shut my eyes and focused on the feeling of the air around me, the sounds of the forest lulling me into a false sense of security. The rustling kept going, though, like it was waiting for something or someone. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up, needing to pee. I looked around the tent, noticing that the other guys were still asleep, their bodies sprawled across the floor. I didn't want to wake them, so I decided to venture out by myself. We had a pretty secluded spot, and I didn't think it would be that far to walk to find a place to relieve myself. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, squinting in the dark as my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight. I had my flashlight with me, but I decided not to turn it on. I didn't want to disturb anyone else. I stepped lightly on the forest floor, trying to be as quiet as possible. I wandered away from the tent, further than I had originally intended, but I figured I was just a bit too lazy to turn back yet. There was still that rustling sound in the trees, but I had grown used to it. It was only when I took a few steps further away from the camp that I realized just how thick the forest was around me. The trees felt taller and darker, the shadows deeper. I kept walking. After a minute, I finally found a small clearing and squatted down, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness. The rustling sound, which had been constant, seemed to have faded into the background. All I could hear was the faint chirping of crickets and the sound of my breathing, shallow in the cool night air. As I finished, I stood up and turned to head back to the tent. It was then that I realized how far I had actually wandered. I wasn't sure where exactly I had gone, but I had stepped far enough away from the camp that I couldn't see any of the familiar trees or the tent's outline. The forest was thick with underbrush, and I couldn't make out anything around me. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees. I should have brought my flashlight, I realized then, and cursed myself for not doing so. I felt uneasy, and suddenly, that rustling sound, which I had dismissed earlier, felt more menacing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind. But the wind didn't rustle leaves like that. It was too deliberate, too continuous. It didn't feel like nature anymore. I started walking back towards the camp, trying to retrace my steps, but everything around me looked the same. The trees were thick, the shadows deep. The forest had swallowed me up more than I realized, and now I was lost in it. I thought I saw a shape in the distance, and my heart skipped. It was just the shadows playing tricks on me, I told myself, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I pushed on, trying to stay calm, and after a minute, I thought I saw the faint outline of our tent in the distance. I started walking faster, hoping to make my way back. That's when I finally understood what had been causing the rustling. It wasn't just a random breeze, no, the sound was the river. The river that ran nearby, down in a gorge I hadn't even realized was so close. The sound of the water flowing over rocks, mixed with the wind, made it seem like the trees themselves were alive, moving in unnatural ways. I had wandered so close to the river's edge that I could feel the cold moisture in the air. The water roared in the distance, a sound I hadn't recognized in the dark. I wasn't just a few feet from the riverbank. I had nearly stumbled right into it. The ground near the edge was steep and treacherous, and if I had taken one more wrong step, I could have been pulled into the water without anyone even realizing I was gone. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly turned and found my way back to the tent, my feet nearly slipping in the wet, mossy ground. I finally made it back, heart still racing. I crawled into the tent and lay there, staring up at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than a bad fall or a cold swim. The next morning, I learned just how close I had come to disaster. I had been so close to the river that I could have fallen in without anyone knowing. The water was fast-moving and dangerous, especially after dark when it was harder to see. The rustling sound that had freaked me out wasn't the wind, after all. It was the river, roaring louder than I could have ever imagined in the dead of night. I never went back outside without my flashlight after that, and I've never been that careless since. The memory of the water, so close, still makes me uneasy when I think back on that trip. I had been so sure of myself, convinced that I knew the woods and the night, but in the end, I learned just how easily nature could take me by surprise. I think about that night often, especially when I'm out camping. It serves as a reminder. Always respect the wilderness, and never forget the little things, like bringing a flashlight, because it only takes one small mistake to change everything. It was the middle of October, that weird time in the desert when it could be freezing in the morning but hot by noon. My uncle has always been into dirt biking, and every few weeks, he and a group of his friends would haul out their trailers, bikes, coolers, and gear to some far-off patch of BLM land in the desert. No service, no bathrooms, no shade, just open scrubland and endless space. They liked it that way. No rules, no crowds, just the dirt and the bikes. I wasn't with them on this trip, but I remember the story clear as day because of how weird it was. My uncle told me when he got back, and the way he told it, calm, no drama, no big expressions, made it stick even more. You could tell it rattled him a little, though he wouldn't admit it. They'd arrived the day before, just before sundown, pulling their trailers in a rough circle. My uncle had one of those toy haulers that lets down into a ramp for the bikes, and his friend Mike had a small pull-behind camper. They always brought folding chairs, coolers, portable grills, firewood, and sometimes even a cornhole set. That night had been like most of their trips. They grilled sausages, had a small fire, drank beers, and talked trash until late. Then they put the fire out with sand and went to bed. At some point in the early morning, just as the sky was starting to change from black to that dull bluish gray, my uncle woke up. He was always the first one up. Habit from years of being on job sites early, I guess. He stepped out of the trailer, wrapped in a hoodie, and went over to the generator to get it running before everyone else stirred. That's when he saw the guy. The chairs they'd circled around the fire pit were still there, and in one of them, sitting completely still, was a man. He wasn't one of my uncle's friends. He was just sitting there, elbows on knees, looking into the faint orange smolder of the fire pit like he'd been doing it for hours. At first, my uncle thought maybe one of the guys had invited someone else, or maybe it was Mike's cousin or something. But after a few seconds, it hit him that he didn't recognize the guy at all. He looked around, scanning the scrub brush and low hills that stretched in every direction. There was no car, no truck, no ATV, no dirt bike. Nothing. No headlights, no tracks in the sand that looked fresh, no boot prints even. They were at least a mile from the next known campsite. Probably more. That's how they liked it. They picked remote spots, always far from the usual crowds. Still, the guy didn't move or say anything. My uncle didn't know what to make of it, but he wasn't the type to panic. He walked back inside, closed the trailer door, and woke up two of the other guys. They all came outside together and walked over to the man. When they got closer, they could smell alcohol coming off him. Not the sharp, fresh kind either. More like the sour, stale stench of someone who'd been drinking for a long time. He was asleep. Somehow, he'd sat down in the chair and passed out upright. The guy looked rough. Dirty jeans, a sweatshirt that had seen better days, sunburn peeling on his nose and cheeks, and caked dust around his shoes like he'd been walking a while. When they woke him up, he didn't freak out or try to run or act weird. He just blinked a bunch and looked around like he was trying to figure out where he was. Once he was fully awake, they started trying to figure out where he came from. My uncle said the guy looked dazed, dehydrated, hungover. It took a few minutes before he seemed to get his bearings. Then he asked if they could give him a ride back to where his camp was. Said he'd gotten turned around or something. One of the guys agreed to take him, so my uncle climbed in the front seat of the truck with him while the guy rode in the back. They figured if he was in trouble or something, it was better to help him out before the heat of the day hit. In the desert, that kind of morning chill fades fast, and by 10 it can feel like a blow dryer on your face. They drove in the direction the guy pointed. At first, they thought he was confused. There was nothing out there for miles. But after a little over 3 miles, they saw a small group of RVs parked near the edge of a dry wash. A few people were milling around, and when my uncle pulled up, he noticed there were state troopers there too. 2 patrol SUVs with lights but no sirens. As soon as they pulled up, one of the troopers walked over. My uncle stayed quiet while the other guy got out and started talking to the officer. The trooper listened, nodded, then motioned to another officer, and they brought the guy over to talk more. Nobody seemed freaked out. More like they were just checking boxes, making sure nothing got missed. One of the people at the camp, a woman in her 30s, came over and started thanking my uncle and his buddy for bringing the guy back. Turns out he'd been drinking like crazy the night before and, for some reason, took one of the camp's golf carts and just drove off into the night. No one noticed right away, but when they realized he was gone and the golf cart was missing, they panicked and called it in. They searched around their camp, sent a few guys out in trucks to scout the area, but no one found anything. Eventually, the golf cart was located off a rough trail about 1.5 miles out of camp. It had run out of gas. The guy must have just ditched it and started walking in a random direction. From there, he must have just wandered the desert on foot, probably still drunk or at least totally out of it, until he stumbled on my uncle's trailer in the dark. Somehow, he avoided cactus patches, didn't fall into a wash, didn't get bit by anything. He just walked, maybe for hours in the pitch black, and then sat down in one of the folding chairs and passed out. The troopers said they were just glad he hadn't gotten hurt. The woman who thanked my uncle said this wasn't the first time the guy had done something dumb while drinking, but it was the first time he disappeared into the desert. My uncle and his friend didn't stick around. They got in the truck and drove back to their own site. By then, The sun was up and the chill was gone. It was shaping up to be another dry, hot day. Back at their camp, they fired up the generator, made some coffee, and tried to go about their usual day. But the vibe had shifted a bit. Everyone was quieter than usual. It wasn't fear, really, more like unease. The idea that someone could just wander into their camp in the middle of the night without them hearing a thing and sit down in the middle of their stuff, it unsettled them. They didn't pack up or cut the trip short, but they were more careful after that. They checked their surroundings more often, kept their lights on a little longer at night, and made sure the fire was completely out before going to bed. My uncle never said it out loud, but I think it stuck with him how easy it was for someone to get that far out into the desert without help, and how close that could come to ending badly. He told me the story a week later when I was helping him load gear back into his garage. He didn't make it spooky or dramatic, just laid it out the way it happened, and I believed every word of it. There was no ghost, no hallucination, no horror movie twist. Just a guy, drunk and dumb, who wandered into the wrong camp in the middle of nowhere. But somehow that made it even creepier, because it actually happened. And out there, in that open desert with no fences, no streetlights, and no neighbors for miles, it makes you realize how easy it is for someone or something to show up out of nowhere and be sitting right next to you without you ever hearing a sound. That was enough to give me the chills. It was a cold night in the countryside, the kind of chill that settled in your bones and made the quiet of the world feel a little too heavy. We lived on a farm just outside of a small village, and the woods started about 15 meters from our front door. Our house was isolated enough that you could stand on the porch and hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful for the most part, but sometimes at night, that quiet had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, like something out there was just waiting for you to slip up. My brother, Jamie, was a creature of the night. He'd often take our dog, Chester, for walks in the woods after dark. Chester was a big, friendly lab, and he had a nose for adventure. He'd roam the fields and woods like it was his second home, always coming back for his dinner without a fuss. It didn't matter if it was 10 p.m. or later. The woods were his territory, and he loved being out there. It was around 10 p.m. one evening when Jamie came back looking shaken, his face pale, his eyes wide. I was sitting in the kitchen, messing around with my phone when I heard the door creak open. I thought Jamie would just be laughing about something silly that had happened out there, like he usually did. But this time, he just stood there in the doorway, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "What's up?" I asked, setting my phone down, sensing the change in his demeanor. He didn't answer right away. He looked over his shoulder at the woods, like he was making sure nothing was out there, and then finally spoke, his voice low and a bit shaky. "I lost Chester," he said. My heart sank. Chester? Lost? That was impossible. The dog had been in and out of those woods more times than I could count. He knew every tree, every path. He had never gotten lost before, not once. "What do you mean, you lost him?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Jamie took a deep breath and started explaining. He said that he had taken Chester out for one of their usual walks. It was a clear night, with a full moon, and the woods had felt peaceful. But as they were walking deeper into the trees, Jamie's phone, which he used to navigate sometimes, had died. He wasn't too worried about it, though. He knew the woods well enough to get by without a phone. But then, something strange happened. Jamie told me that, as they were walking, right before he lost sight of the house, a beam of light had appeared, circling his feet. It wasn't like a flashlight or anything. It was a circular beam, almost like a spotlight, but brighter. It didn't last long, just a second or two, and then, before he could react, the light shot off into the woods in one direction, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. That's when Chester had disappeared. 1 minute he was there, walking calmly beside Jamie, and the next the dog was gone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Jamie said he called out for him, but there was no response. He looked around, but the woods were quiet, unnaturally quiet, like everything had gone still. He'd retraced his steps, but Chester wasn't anywhere to be found. Panicked, Jamie had rushed back home. He didn't know what else to do. That's when he came to get me. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and we both headed back out into the woods. The night was cold and still, the kind of night where even the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animals were absent. The woods seemed unnervingly silent. I felt a tightness in my chest as I walked, a knot of anxiety that I couldn't shake off. There was something wrong about the way Jamie had looked when he came back. The way he described the light, the way Chester had just disappeared, it didn't sit right with me. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows on the trees. My mind raced, trying to think of anything that could explain what had happened. But nothing made sense. It was as if the woods themselves had swallowed up the dog, and whatever had caused that strange light was still lurking somewhere, unseen. I was about 20 seconds into the woods when I saw something in the distance, just a flicker of movement behind a large oak tree. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel a surge of relief mixed with confusion. There, just behind the tree, was Chester. He was standing still, his head low, his body tense. But there was something off about him. Chester wasn't acting like himself. He wasn't running around or wagging his tail like usual. Instead, he was moving slowly, as if each step was a struggle. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he was trembling. The way he looked at me was unsettling, like he didn't recognize me, or maybe like he was scared of me. "Chester," I called softly, stepping closer. He didn't respond the way he normally would, with his usual excited bark or wagging tail. He just kept walking slowly, almost dragging his feet, his eyes darting nervously around as if something was watching us. I called his name again, but he didn't stop. He just turned and began walking back toward the house. I followed him, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam flickering nervously. Chester didn't seem to care that I was behind him. He just walked with that same slow, fearful pace, his head low and his body tense. It was like he was in a daze, and I couldn't figure out why. What had happened out here? What had he seen or heard that made him act like this? By the time we got back to the house, Chester had stopped at the door and just sat down, looking up at me with those sad, fearful eyes. He didn't want to come inside, but he didn't move either. It was as if he was waiting for something, or maybe he was just too exhausted to move any further. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting Chester follow me in. He walked straight to his bed and lay down without a sound. He didn't even look at me. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide and unfocused. It was like he had been through something that I couldn't even begin to understand. I sat down beside him, running my hand gently over his fur. He didn't react. He just lay there, still and quiet. I stayed with him for a while, not knowing what else to do, not knowing what had happened in those woods, or what had caused him to act this way. But one thing was clear. Something had scared him. Something out there in the woods that night had shaken him to his core. Over the next few days, Chester slowly returned to his usual self, but there was something different about him. He was more cautious, more alert. He didn't go near the woods anymore, even though they had always been his favorite place. Whenever we went outside, he would give the woods a wide berth, like he could feel something lurking just beyond the trees. Jamie and I talked about it a few times, trying to piece together what had happened. We both agreed that whatever it wasn't something normal. It wasn't just a wild animal or some weird natural occurrence. There was something else out there, something that made Chester act the way he did. We never went back into those woods the same way again. The strange light, Chester's fear, the silence that had swallowed the night. None of it made sense. But one thing I knew for sure, something in those woods had changed, and we weren't going to be the same either. The woods had always been a place of comfort, but now, they were something else entirely. Chester never ventured near the woods again, and neither did I. And from that night on, the quiet that had once been soothing now felt suffocating. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, just out of sight. And I knew, deep down, that the woods held secrets we were never meant to uncover. A few years ago, I went camping with a large group of friends. There were probably about 45 of us, a mix of old friends and a few new faces, all scattered across various campsites. We were excited for the weekend, everyone in good spirits, ready for the outdoors and the bonding time ahead. The main campground was full when my two friends and I arrived. No big deal, though. There were plenty of spots across the road near the river. It was quieter, a little more secluded, and we figured we'd have a better experience without all the noise from the larger group. We pulled up and set up our tent next to a dense patch of trees. The river was nearby, the sound of water rushing over rocks filling the air as we unloaded our gear. The sun was beginning to set, and the cool evening air felt nice against my skin. We hadn't even started the campfire yet when we realized the campground across the road had filled up more than we expected. We could hear the laughter and chatter of the larger group, so we were thankful for the peacefulness of our spot. The first night was great. We had a fire, roasted marshmallows, and caught up with one another. The night passed without incident, the sounds of crickets and the river lulling us into a calm sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted, and drifted off without a care in the world. I was in the middle of a dream when I woke up. It was the second night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the last remnants of warmth were dissipating from the air. I had no idea what time it was, but the darkness felt deep and still, almost too still. The kind of stillness that makes you uneasy when you're in the woods, surrounded by nature. The first thing that clued me in was the sound. Something was moving around outside our tent. I thought it was probably a deer or some other small animal. It was common for animals to wander through the area, especially at night. But then I heard a growl. It was low, deep, and chilling, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. It sounded too deep, too guttural. I froze, lying in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to listen more closely. The growl came again, louder this time. There was no mistaking it. It was a cougar. The sound was unmistakable. I had heard about mountain lions being in the area, but I never really thought it would happen to us. I was instantly awake, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the tension in the air, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the animal moving around, pacing just outside our tent. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the movement of brush being disturbed. It was all too real. I could almost imagine the predator just outside, its eyes watching us, waiting. I glanced at my two friends, who were both still sleeping, unaware of the danger outside. One of them was closer to me, so I nudged her awake. I didn't want to wake the other friend, thinking she might panic and make things worse. My friend stirred, groggily opening her eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered, barely audible. "There's something out there," I replied, my voice tight with fear. "I think it's a cougar." Her eyes snapped fully awake, and I could see the fear take over her expression. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was scared. I wasn't much better, honestly. We both lay there in silence, listening, the sounds of the cougar still just outside our tent. I had no weapon. I didn't carry a gun, and I had left my knife in the car. We were completely defenseless. All I could do was hope and pray that whatever it was, it would go away. Minutes dragged on. Felt like hours, but I knew it couldn't have been that long. The growling stopped, but the animal was still close by, its presence unmistakable. I could hear it moving, its heavy footfalls just outside the thin fabric of the tent. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system. My breath came in shallow bursts, too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to move. Every second felt like it could be my last. The two of us sat there in the dark, the silence almost unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, even if I had wanted to. Every sound from the outside made my heart leap into my throat. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every distant crack of a twig. It all made me jump. We sat, tense, waiting. I kept thinking about what I'd read about mountain lions, how they stalk their prey, how they attack without warning. It felt like we were sitting ducks, waiting for an attack we couldn't defend ourselves against. We prayed. I don't know if it was for comfort or for strength, or for the animal to just go away. But we prayed, and we held each other's hands tightly, not speaking but knowing that the situation was dire. I couldn't hear the cougar anymore, but I knew it was still out there. I kept imagining its yellow eyes glaring through the darkness, watching for any sign of weakness. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the growling stopped. The heavy footsteps faded away. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the calm, peaceful silence I'd hoped for. It was the kind of silence that comes after danger has passed, but it still leaves a lingering sense of unease. We didn't dare move for a while, not until we were sure the cougar had really gone. I don't know how long it took before I finally fell back into an exhausted, restless sleep. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was up, and the world outside looked peaceful again. Birds were chirping, the river was still rushing, and everything seemed normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had gripped me the night before. The rest of the group gathered around the campfire later that morning, chatting and laughing, unaware of the terror we had faced. When I told them about the cougar, I was met with mixed reactions. Some laughed it off, saying I'd probably just heard a coyote or a bear. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what had been outside our tent. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. Apparently, the cougars, if that's what they were, weren't cougars at all. They were a couple of guys from the other campsite, a group of older men in their 30s who thought it would be funny to play around and make animal noises to freak us out. They had been lurking around our tent, growling and making strange sounds in the dark, trying to mess with us. They had no idea how terrifying it had been for us, how we had been terrified for our lives, convinced we were going to be attacked. I don't know if I should have been mad or relieved. Part of me was angry that they had played such a dangerous game, but another part of me was just thankful it wasn't really a cougar. Either way, the whole experience shook me up. I couldn't look at camping the same way after that. The peace of the woods, the calmness of nature, it all felt tainted somehow, as if the wild had turned on me, even if it hadn't. I left the campsite the next morning. The idea of staying another night after all that had happened was too much. I packed up my things, said my goodbyes, and left with my friends, heading back to civilization. The whole experience left a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't even want to talk about it anymore. It wasn't just the fear or the danger. It was the realization that something as simple as a night in the woods could turn into a nightmare without any warning. I haven't gone camping since. The idea of spending another night out there, in the quiet of the woods, knowing what can happen when things go wrong, just doesn't appeal to me. I know I'll never forget the fear of that night, the terror of knowing there was something out there that could kill us at any moment. And I'll always wonder if it was the animals we were supposed to fear, or something much worse. I decided to take a solo camping trip in early October, right after the first frost of the season. I wanted to get away for a few days, just to clear my head and enjoy the cold air and silence. There's a river in a remote part of the national forest that I'd only been to once before. It's not on any popular hiking trail, no marked campsites, and you have to drive 25 minutes down a narrow dirt road that's more ruts and potholes than anything else. After that, you hike in another 2 miles with no real trail to speak of, just following deer paths and the sound of water. That's exactly what I was looking for. No people, no noise, just trees, the river, and whatever animals were still lingering after the summer. I drove out in my beat-up for runner with my pack, my tent, a bear canister, food for 4 days, and enough gear to stay warm even if the temps dropped below freezing at night. I even brought a small hatchet to split wood for fires, though I'd have to collect deadfall since you're not allowed to cut living trees. I had my topo maps and a compass too, but I'd been there before and felt like I remembered the way. The drive-in took forever. The dirt road was worse than I remembered. Fallen branches scratched against the sides of the truck, and I had to stop a few times to move logs or big rocks out of the way. No one had driven through there in a long time. Once I finally parked, I locked up the truck and started hiking in. I knew the river was about 2 miles southeast, mostly downhill through thick pine forest with a few open meadows along the way. I got to the river after maybe an hour and a half. I followed the water upstream another half-mile until I found a little clearing I remembered. It sat back from the water about 30 feet and was surrounded by a natural horseshoe of boulders and thick brush. The trees formed a high canopy overhead, and you could barely see the sky except straight above. It felt tucked away, almost hidden, which I liked. It was about 4 p.m. when I dropped my pack and started setting up. I got the tent pitched just before sunset. It was already getting cold. I threw on my thicker jacket and went out to find wood. There was plenty of dry stuff near the base of the trees, and I found a few bigger dead limbs that I could break apart for a longer burn. I got a fire going with some effort and made a quick dinner, ramen and jerky. Simple but warm. I sat near the fire as the sky went fully dark, listening to the river and the occasional rustle from the trees. It was peaceful, but something started to feel a little off around 9 p.m. I kept catching a faint clicking or tapping sound from the trees behind my tent. At first I thought it was water dripping, maybe pine cones falling, but it didn't sound like that. It had a weird rhythm, like 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 2 more. I turned my headlamp toward the sound a few times but never saw anything. I figured maybe it was a woodpecker or something nesting up there. Still, it gave me this strange feeling in my chest, just an edge of discomfort. I stayed by the fire a little longer than I normally would have, then doused it, packed my food into the bear canister, and wedged it under a big rock about 30 yards from camp. I climbed into the tent, zipped up the flap, and crawled into my sleeping bag. It was cold, but not unbearable. I read a few pages of my book by headlamp and then turned it off. I didn't sleep much that first night. I kept waking up. It wasn't that I was cold. I just couldn't relax. I kept hearing that same tapping or clicking sound, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer. A few times it sounded like it was maybe 10 feet from the tent. I thought about raccoons or squirrels, maybe even a fox, but I never heard rustling or sniffing or any movement. Just that same dry, deliberate tapping. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off for a bit and didn't wake again until light started filtering through the trees. I crawled out and stretched. Everything looked normal. No signs of animals. No tracks in the soft dirt around my tent. I made breakfast and hiked up the ridge behind my camp just to scout. From the top, you could see across the river valley and down into the pine forest beyond. No smoke, no tents, no sign of other people. I spent the day wandering up and down the river. Fished a bit, caught nothing. Collected more wood, made some tea, cleaned up camp. It was colder than the day before, and some of the water near the rocks had a thin layer of ice in the shadows. I kept my jacket on all day. By late afternoon, I was already feeling tired. I made dinner, got the fire going early, and tried to push away the unease from the night before. I told myself I'd imagine the noise, or it was just small animals. It was silly to get worked up over nothing. That night I was exhausted and climbed into my sleeping bag early. The fire was still glowing, but I figured it would die out soon. I lay there listening to the wind in the trees and the flow of the river. It should have been calming, but I still felt tense. Then around midnight, I woke up again. There was no sound at first, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's watching you. Then I heard it again, tapping. Same rhythm. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was closer this time, much closer. I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My eyes adjusted and I scanned the tree line with my headlamp. Nothing moved, but the tapping started again behind me this time. I spun around, turned the light that way, still nothing. No eyes reflecting, no movement, just the trees. I told myself it had to be a tree branch swaying and hitting something, maybe one of the boulders. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sound kept coming every 10 minutes or so. Then it would stop, then start again, then stop. I finally passed out again sometime after 2 a.m. In the morning, I got up and walked the perimeter of my campsite. I found something I hadn't seen the day before. Fresh mud on one of the bigger boulders, smudged like someone had slipped climbing over it. There were also a few scuff spots in the dirt, like boot tracks that had been half erased. I knelt and looked closer. It didn't look like animal prints. Not hooves or paws. It looked like the ball of a foot, but the prints were vague. The dirt was soft, but not soft enough to hold clear prints. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't seen another person since I left the car. I wasn't anywhere near a trail. If someone had come through here, they were either extremely lost or didn't want to be seen. Either way, it felt wrong. I kept my axe with me that whole day. I didn't go far from camp. Every time I stepped away, I kept turning back, checking the trees. I barely ate that night. I just boiled water, choked down a few bites, and sat by the fire, gripping the axe. It was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, not even birds. Just the river. I stayed up until maybe midnight, then finally crawled into the tent. I left the axe right next to me and didn't zip the flap all the way shut. I wanted to hear if anything came close. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard something different. Not tapping this time, not rustling, breathing, low, steady breathing, just outside the tent. Not animal breathing, not sniffing or panting, just quiet, steady breaths. Like someone was standing right outside, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise and my mouth went dry. I reached slowly for the axe. My hand was shaking. I couldn't hear footsteps, just that soft breathing. Then it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Finally, I peeked out the flap. Nothing. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the trees. I sat there in silence, staring into the dark for what must have been another hour before I finally backed into the sleeping bag and closed the flap. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed everything. Fast. Didn't even eat. Just stuffed my gear into the pack, grabbed the bear canister, and started hiking. I didn't take the usual way back. I cut uphill, climbing fast and not stopping, trying to stay off the obvious deer trails. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. I never heard anyone, never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for days. When I finally reached the truck, it looked untouched. No broken windows, no signs of anyone. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. I didn't relax until I hit pavement nearly 40 minutes later. I drove straight home without stopping. Back home, I checked the local news and forest alerts. Nothing. No missing persons. No reports of strange activity. Nothing at all. But something was out there. Someone. I've been camping alone for years. I've dealt with bears, storms, even minor injuries far from help. But I've never felt fear like I did on that trip. Not fear of animals. Fear of people. Of being watched. Followed. I haven't been back to that river since. I doubt I ever will. I still go camping, but I stay near trails now. Near people. I don't need total solitude anymore. I'd rather hear someone's music through the trees than sit alone in the dark wondering if I'm being hunted. Because whatever that was, whoever that was, they were out there on purpose. And they didn't want to be found.